Hello and welcome to the 74th meeting of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Review Committee. My name is Melanie O'Brien, and I'm the designated federal official to the Review Committee. I'd like to welcome the Review Committee members, the National NAGPRA program staff, and all in attendance. I am pleased that virtual meeting format has allowed so many of you to join us today. As of right now, we have 129 participants in this meeting. This is the second of two meetings held this month. The committee met on November 12th as well. I'll note that we have tentatively scheduled upcoming meetings beginning at the end of January. You can find more information on the events page of the National NAGPRA website. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded. The recording, transcripts, and meeting minutes will be made publicly available after this meeting, and those will include the names of those in attendance during today's call. If you object to this, you may disconnect at this time. This is a meeting of the Federal Advisory Committee established under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, and this meeting is regulated by the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, and its implementing regulations. FACA requires that meetings be held in public at reasonably accessible locations and convenient times, and with adequate advance notice of each meeting published in the Federal Register. This meeting was noticed in the Federal Register on October 28th, 2021. An agenda for this meeting and materials are posted to the NAGPRA program events page. FACA requires the committee have a valid charter, renewable every 2 years. The current review committee charter was filed on November 27th, 2020. NAGPRA, or the Act, as well as FACA and the charter, govern the objectives and scope of activities of this committee. The purpose of this review committee is to monitor and review the implementation of the inventory and identification process, and to monitor and review repatriation activities under sections 5, 6, and 7 of the Act. The review committee is also responsible for reporting to Congress on the progress and any barriers encountered in carrying out its responsibilities. With that as introduction, I'd like to start with a roll call of the committee members. Please answer out loud. John Beaver.
Present.
Honor Keeler.
Here.
Barnaby Lewis.
Here.
Timothy McEwen.
Here.
Frank McManaman.
Present.
Shelby Tisdale.
Present.
Thank you. Currently, the review committee only has 6 appointed members. The committee is made up of 7 members in total, but we are absent 1 appointed member at this time. The charter for the review committee does not contain a quorum requirement, and a meeting may be held with fewer than 7 members present. FACA requires that the committee membership be fairly balanced in terms of point of view represented and functions to be performed. As the DFO, I have determined that it's in the best interest of the department, the secretary, and this committee that this meeting proceed with only 6 members. At your last meeting on November 12th, Frank McManaman was selected as the chair of this committee. Mr. Chair, I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. Before we move on, I would like to acknowledge the individuals who are assisting me today in conducting this meeting. With me are attorneys from the Department of the Interior Office of the Solicitor, Brady Blasco with the Division of Parks and Wildlife, and Stephen Simpson with the Division on Indian Affairs. From the National NAGPRA program, Lisa Koshelski is the review committee coordinator, responsible for organizing this meeting and preparing minutes and transcripts of these proceedings. In general, these meetings begin with an invocation or a traditional welcome, and we do have someone scheduled to provide an opening prayer along with the first agenda item. As a means of introduction to the first agenda item, I would like to remind the committee and those in attendance of the provisions for a finding of fact under NAGPRA. Under 25 USC 3006 C, the review committee is responsible for reviewing and making findings of fact related to the identity, cultural affiliation, or return of cultural items upon the request of an affected party. In carrying out its responsibility, the review committee is charged with ensuring a fair and objective consideration and assessment of all the relevant information. On October 22nd, 2021, I received a request for a finding of fact from affected parties. The affected parties provided a request along with documentation. Those are all available in the meeting materials on the NAGPRA events page. The finding of fact asks the review committee to consider a question. The question is whether the human remains and funerary items originating from and adjacent to Moundville in Alabama are culturally affiliated with the Muskogean-speaking tribes. Further information is available in the documentation and will be provided during the presentation today. With that, I would like to ask Mr. Yahola with the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma to provide an opening prayer. Mr. Yahola, it's okay if we continue the recording?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you.
Ibukfanga, Ajulagi, Inita Pumbal Hoat, Lakimahi Mado Magas, Simadot Gidadadi Mongus, Hijia, Agiletska, Punhaidos, Na Ibazazagat, Ozimahi, Imongus Doison, Egan Mujasi, Okhabaget, Ayibat, Ilga Hoski Doyat, Istimaniti Doyat, Anugetska, Hakosamga, Abu Heska, Iaskida in Ganzaba, Yelaji, other lock to is Nakabastidan Ojia, Manti Hobel Galegat, Mohoban, his Hoja, Nak Aktua get Man Mujanetta Hajome, Abastida Ojia, the Mumbanet, and Eskada Poyadusi. Unakadari Hayoags Washwags do wish to no measure. On Figi Nokidari Mongoston, Fatchitska, Hayome, Ozia, Hayom Adulok to is moment at Adigos in Hayome. Amunakadami Washwags do wish to no measure. Chinjik to the daddy of Mikida Omegas, Abokada, Hayat, Magesta, Ho.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yahola. I would like now to invite the presenters to please turn on your video and audio for your introductions.
And if I could say on behalf of the committee, we appreciate, Mr. Yahola, your invocation and blessing. Thank you very much. And we look forward to hearing from all of the presenters on this important topic.
Thank you. The Coalition of Muskegean Tribes that has submitted this finding of fact determination request to National NAGPRA Review Committee would like to thank you for your time and attention in us presenting our information. We'd like to begin by introducing the speakers. Lito Sahof Chifoyeti Ian Thompson, Choctaw Mention Naholo Sia. Hello, my name is Ian Thompson. I'm Choctaw and Euro-American, and I serve as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma.
Donna Chohochif Gross. I'm a legata konopoge does. Momen amatola teledegi does. Good morning, everyone. My name is Turner Hunt, and I'm with the Muskogee Nation Historic and Cultural Preservation Department. Thank you for having us here today. Appreciate it.
Kirk Perry. I'm an executive officer for the Chickasaw Nation Historic Preservation Division.
Raylan Butler, Jaho Jifkados, Almalegada Wakogi, Almadowa Pecan Tallahassee. My name's Raylan Butler, and I'm the manager of the Historic and Cultural Preservation Department.
Yes, hi, I'm Tina Marie Osceola, and I'm the director for the Tribal Historic Preservation Office for the Seminole Tribe of Florida.
This is Deanna Bird, and I serve as our NAGPRA liaison here at the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma.
Moundville Archaeological Site is located on the southeastern bank of the Black Warrior River in present-day Tuscaloosa County, Alabama. The site's primary occupation spanned from AD 1050 to AD 1650. At its height, Moundville was the second largest Native American settlement north of the Valley of Mexico. Are you all seeing our slideshow?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
The Muscogean-speaking tribes are wholly indigenous to the American Southeast. We lived nowhere else but the Southeast previous to the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. Our collective ancestors lived in an area around Moundville long before Moundville was conceived. Our collective ancestors lived at the Moundville site itself. Our collective ancestors lived in adjacent communities that were tied to Moundville as kin. Our collective ancestors also lived in daughter communities that budded off from Moundville, moved on to other areas. The final 100 years of Moundville's occupation came after European arrival to the region. This time coincided with a period of horrific population loss as a result of disease and conflict. 1650 is the date archaeology is given for the last occupation of Moundville. The image that you see on the screen shows the location of the Moundville site in relation to the area that was occupied by the Muscogean-speaking tribes in 1650. As this graphic shows, at the time of its final occupation, the Moundville site was located exclusively within the lands of Muscogean-speaking tribes. The closest non-Muscogean-speaking tribe lived 140 miles away from Moundville. The language, art, religion, bloodline, and culture of the people of Moundville live on today in the Muscogean-speaking tribes. We're culturally affiliated with Moundville. The evidence for the cultural affiliation of the Muscogean-speaking tribes with Moundville is abundant, deep, and interconnected. We cannot possibly present all of this evidence in an hour-long slot, but we can summarize. Our presentation is organized according to the cultural affiliation criteria given in NAGPRA. For each criterion, we'll first present a summary of how the Muscogean-speaking tribes are collectively culturally affiliated with Moundville under that criterion. Then, one or two tribes will present their individual part of that evidence before we move on to the next criterion. In addition to this presentation, the claimant tribes invite the committee to look at the documents we have shared, which present the evidence of cultural affiliation in more detail. To begin, we'd like to speak briefly about the shared identity of the Muscogean-speaking tribes. The Muscogean-speaking tribes are indigenous to the American Southeast. Our languages are related to each other, together comprising the Muscogean language family. This linguistic relatedness speaks to deep connections and common origins. Many of our origin accounts depict some of the Muscogean tribes as once being the same tribe. Our oral histories talk about generations of interacting with each other in the region around Moundville. Our traditional cultures share a tremendous number of elements in common. Our traditional religions include many common concepts, dances, and ceremonies. We all share a traditional matrilineal and matrilocal system. For generations, families within our tribes have been intermarrying. Our elders tell us that the Muscogean tribes are related to each other. We have a shared history of colonization and a shared history of rebuilding from it. Through the upheaval of removal, many of our tribes continue to develop and participate in such institutions like the Four Mothers Society. Today, the Muscogean-speaking tribes continue to be formally connected on governmental, religious, and social levels through institutions that include the Intertribal Council of the Five Civilized Tribes, the United South and Eastern Tribes, the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference, the Green Corn Ceremony, intertribal stickball and cornstalk shooting competitions, and the Star Alliance. Nowhere is the reverence that the Muscogean-speaking tribes hold for our shared identity more apparent than in the collaborative work that we do to properly care for our mutual ancestors. The map on the screen shows the homeland areas of the claimant tribes superimposed on a map of the pre-Moundville settlements in Alabama. Shortly before the Mississippian era settlement of Moundville began, late woodland groups, known to archaeologists as Miller III populations, moved into the Black Warrior River Valley from present-day Mississippi. You can see that at the upper left of the map. People and cultural influence from the Shiloh phase of the Western Tennessee River also moved into the Black Warrior area, setting in motion some of the developments in material culture that have come to define Moundville. Affiliated groups moved into the Tennessee River Valley of northeastern Alabama, giving rise to the Hobbs Island phase at the upper right of the map. The Hobbs Island phase would share a cultural connection with Moundville. Early in its history, Moundville began budding off daughter communities that relocated to other regions to retain connections with Moundville. One of the earliest was a movement to Mobile Bay in AD 1100 at the bottom left of the map. As the community at Moundville developed, culturally affiliated groups in adjacent areas were connected with its trajectory. the community on Mobile Bay remained connected with developments at Moundville in terms of pottery and culture for centuries. Similarly, on the central Tombigbee, to the north of there, the Somerville 1 through 4 phases closely track Moundville 1 through 4 phases. On the upper Tombigbee, the Tibby Creek, Lions Bluff, and Sorrells phases similarly show close connection with developments at Moundville. From AD 1400 to 1600, a large population left Moundville for the upper Alabama River Valley, setting in motion the Big Eddy and Foreman phases at the center of the map. These are generally believed by archaeologists to represent the Native American communities who encountered Hernando de Soto in 1540. In the years after the battle, part of this community relocated as far east as the Middle Chattahoochee Valley, giving rise to a segment of the Muskogee and Seminole. Other parts moved downriver, giving rise to segments of the Choctaw people. During the 1400s, other populations from Moundville and Moundville-derived communities moved up the Tombigbee River into the Starkville, Mississippi area, giving rise to segments of the Chickasaw and Alabama tribes. As all of the Moundville-descended and Moundville-affiliated communities responded to colonial disease and turmoil, the iteration of Muscogean-speaking tribes that we see before you today was formed.
I'd like to start by simply proposing two different definitions of culture. V. Gordon Child in 1929 and 1930 proposed the archaeological definition of culture. Paraphrasing, he says, we shall call a culture group or just a culture based off of associated traits of artifacts, with archaeologists will assume or infer that these materials represent people. He later describes it as distinctive artifacts found in graves and settlements over a given geographical area, and that is what will be called a culture. Next slide. However, this is not a culture that it's not a definition that most people understand as culture. Leaning back on a very basic definition of culture that the Army taught me is a grouping of values, beliefs, behaviors, and norms. So traditional Muskogee people live, breathe, and exist in the culture. To simply provide some of these examples for values, Aflakwichka, Fachida, Micholgi, Iyaskida, Hopithingi Danakithkida. Our beliefs, the basket is still observed and honored. A Muskogean religion is still practiced. For behaviors, Creek hospitality, our clan and kin, we speak Muskogee and Creek. And for our norms, we have greetings, introductions, and handshakes, and a gender division of labor. Next slide. So this is where I draw a difference between a more holistic definition of culture and the definition of culture that archaeologists use to assume or infer about the past. As we are here for cultural affiliation, it's important to understand the differences in these definitions. And then it is our belief that you can learn more from a living culture than you can from the dead. Next slide. To tell my story, I'm presenting a cultural sequence of the migration of Casita from Moundville eastward towards the rising sun to the Middle Chattahoochee, where they first were documented by Europeans in 1662. The cultural sequence begins in the Black Warrior Valley, the location of Moundville. I will reference the Upper Alabama River, the location of historically documented Muskogee people. I will reference the Lower Tallapoosa, another location at the heart of the Upper Creek Territory. And finally, the Middle Chattahoochee River, the well-known and historically documented location of Casita and Coweta in the 1600s until removal to present-day Oklahoma, minus a 25-year hiatus to the Macon Plateau. I will discuss the Big Eddy phase and the Abercrombie phases as archaeological evidence of Casita's migration. Next slide. The Big Eddy phase is a direct connection to Moundville and represents a migration of people into these areas. Area 2 would be later known as the Tuscaloosa Chiefdom and the ancestors of many Alabama people, and later historically part of the Creek Confederacy. Area 3 is highlighted by the Ebert canebrake site. Ceramic types and varieties present in late Moundville 3 components at Moundville are duplicated at Ebert canebrake. One example is of shared ceramic types is the Carthage incised variation Foster's, which features a prominent hand and long bone motif. These were covered in Moundville, as well as Upper Alabama and the Lower Tallapoosa. The following phase on the Lower Tallapoosa is the Tazi phase, followed by the historic Creek component known as the Tallapoosa phase. Next slide. The Abercrombie phase is the immediate predecessor to known historic creek phases such as Blackmon and Lawson Field. It is characterized by shell-tempered Moundville influenced pottery. C.B. Moore noted in 1907 that the site contained many fragments of shell-tempered pottery. Not many intact vessels have been recovered from Abercrombie, but those that do exist appear to be very similar to looped vessels from Moundville. As part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Mobile District NAGPRA affiliation, archaeologists came to the conclusion that at least part of Moundville 3 group that settled in the upper Alabama continued eastward and settled in the middle Chattahoochee River around 1500 CE and are archaeologically known as the Abercrombie phase. Next slide. Next point to consider is the concept of culture from archaeology's point of view about a given set of characteristics over a geographical range. Copper symbol badges offers insight into these connections. Many copper badges have been recovered from Moundville. They're very similar in appearance to the example from the upper Alabama, and although differing in manufacturing technique, the similarities outweigh the differences and shows that Moundville influence was stretching all the way to the middle Chattahoochee. Next slide. Returning back to our cultural sequence for Casita's migration from Moundville towards the rising sun, based on archaeological evidence, Casita left Moundville before 1450 and moved to the lower Tallapoosa. There, they interacted with the Abika, Coosa, and other known Muskogean tribal towns before continuing on to the Chattahoochee. Coweta was later joined by Casita, after being delayed somewhat, but both are very prominent tribal towns of the Muskogee Nation. For more detailed information on the archaeology, please refer to pages 19 through 41 of the claim letter. Next slide.
I'm going to present archaeological evidence of how Choctaw people are descended from a portion of Moundville through a series of graphics. The information that I'm going to share is deep and detailed, and I'm just going to be able to hit the high points in the time provided. So I invite the review committee to look at the hard copy information that was submitted. It includes much more detail. As noted previously, Moundville budded off numerous daughter communities through its lifetime. One of the first moved down to Mobile Bay around 1100 AD. This was an outpost. They gave rise to the Bottle Creek site and Bottle Creek phases in Mobile Bay area. It stayed in this region for centuries. The sites were still occupied when the French came in the 1700s, beginning permanent European contact. At these sites, which had been culturally affiliated with the Tahomey and Naniaba, the French encountered Choctaw speakers. The French considered the Naniaba and Tahomey to have Choctaw culture, and they considered them part of the Choctaw tribe. Ultimately, the Naniaba and Tahomey moved into the Choctaw area in the 1760s and formally amalgamated with the Choctaw Nation. Through the Naniaba and Tahomey, the Choctaw people are culturally affiliated with Moundville. There were other movements out of Moundville through time. One of these, as noted previously, was in 1400 AD to the central Alabama River Valley. Part of this group moved east through the history that Muskogee Nation has just presented. Other parts moved downriver. Some of the downriver parts were within a settlement encountered by DeSoto in 1540 called Mabilla. Mabilla comes from the Choctaw word Moeli, meaning paddlers. After the battle with DeSoto, the Mabilla traveled downstream to Mobile Bay, where they were encountered by the French in 1700. At the time, the Mobilians spoke the Choctaw language. The French considered them to be part of the Choctaw Nation. The pottery type Fort Dauphin and size is found at both Mobilian and Choctaw settlements, implying that Mobilian women married into the Choctaw community. Other groups followed this route as well. Two of the most important were the Chickasha and the Concha. Both of these groups moved downriver after DeSoto. They were living at the junction of the Alabama and the Tombigbee River in the late 1600s when the French came. Shortly thereafter, due to slaving pressure from the east, both of these groups moved into Choctaw Nation. They already spoke the Choctaw language, they already had Choctaw culture, and when they moved, they were formally amalgamated into the Choctaw tribe. These are not the only groups that moved from this region. Some of the pottery phase, some of the archaeological phases in the central Alabama River, the Liddell phase in particular, produced notched rim ceramics that go back all the way to the time period of Moundville. These same types of ceramics are the most common decorated type found in the archaeological sites of the eastern and southern districts of Choctaw Nation. So 2 of our 3 main districts are connected with Moundville through these pottery types. The Love Oak Creek archaeological site is located about 30 miles west of Moundville. It's contemporary with Moundville. Its archaeological phases follow the Moundville phases. The Love Oak Creek site's excavators culturally affiliated the site with the Choctaw people based on diet, based on ceramics, and based on burial practice. The closest contemporary Choctaw village site is located only 28 miles from Love Oak Creek. Other individuals from Love Oak Creek through its history probably moved upriver, giving rise to portions of the Chickasaw and Alabama tribes. The Shakshioma tribe lived in the area around Starkville, Mississippi at the time of Moundville, and the archaeological phases there track Moundville. A little bit later into the colonial period, the Shakshioma moved west to the Yazoo Basin. There was a conflict, and some of the survivors of the tribe moved in with the Chickasaws. One of the last survivors of the Shakshiomas moved in with the Choctaw people and gave rise to 3 Choctaw chiefs. Her name was Shomaka. Through her, the Choctaw people are affiliated with Moundville. Now we're going to present oral history. The typical American history book begins 500 years ago. The histories of the Muskogean-speaking tribes go back roughly 30 times farther into the past. Our community's experiences were passed down through oral histories, shared at social settings that help ensure their accurate transmission. With colonization having impacted these transmission mechanisms, some parts of our oral histories have naturally been lost, but many parts remain. Surviving Muskogean oral histories tell tribal segments of the broader story of our peoples. These oral histories depict some of our tribes as having been one group at particular points in time. They indicate that we have shared ancestors who occupied the land in and around Moundville since before the Moundville site was founded. They indicate that our ancestors participated and facilitated the cultural developments for which Moundville is today best known. These oral traditions also document our interactions with each other in the Moundville area during the colonial period after Moundville ceased to be inhabited. Finally, through their continued telling, these oral traditions connect our modern communities to the Moundville site today.
The Muskogee Nation is a union of many tribes known as tribal towns. They have their own unique history. Incorporated over time, many of these tribal towns were Muskogee speaking, but other groups such as the Shawnee, Yuchi, and Timucua were also given refuge by our nation. Muskogee people and those within our nation are descended from mound building people who live throughout the southeastern United States. Casita's oral history has been recorded through interactions with outsiders from the account of Chiquili in 1735 to Tusakea Miko in 1790s. Espaiche recounted the history for early American ethnographers in the 1900s, and Philip Deere recounted the history at the 3rd Annual Symposium of the American Indian in 1975. I have no time or standing to recount the history of Casita orally, and attempting to do so with what time I have would be a dishonor to our form of knowledge. What I will say, though, is that these stories have remained to teach us about our past, and I will summarize some of the main points. Casita, Coweta, and Chickasaw have always been closely affiliated. Chickasaw receives its name from being the first to see the sun, followed by Casita, who asked in an ancient language, "Where is the sun?" Coweta, however, was delayed. Some say by a root as they emerged from the ground, others say a briar patch. They received their name, which means those who follow, but they were all of the same people. Chickasaw found a good place to rest, and Casita continued east towards the rising sun, eventually coming to the Chattahoochee River, where they were later joined by Coweta. With all these stories and the archaeology already presented, we have our proof of Casita's migration from Moundville to where they were documented by the Spanish in 1662. Next slide.
Now we'd like to share some of the evidence of cultural affiliation under the criteria of linguistic evidence. Linguistic relatedness is often taken as an indicator of cultural relatedness, both by anthropologists and native speakers. The Muskogean language family is noted as the only language family entirely indigenous to the American Southeast. Muskogean languages spoken today include Alabama, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek Seminole, Coushatta, and Miccosukee. Some of these languages are mutually intelligible with each other. Even the most distant Muskogean languages share familiar words and sentence structures. The linguistic relatedness that connects the Muskogean-speaking tribes comes in part through our shared heritage at Moundville. Historical linguist Emanuel Drexel once wrote that Moundville was Muskogea's heartland. The single point of linguistic evidence more strongly summarizes the cultural affiliation of the Muskogean-speaking tribes with Moundville than the fact that at the time when Moundville was still inhabited, only Muskogean-speaking tribes lived within a 140-mile radius around the site. As a trading and cultural center, Moundville's influence extended across a significant part of the Southeast. The Mobilian trade jargon is connected with Moundville's sphere of influence. This jargon was a simplified language used by individuals from different linguistic backgrounds to communicate with each other over a broad expanse of the Gulf Coast, northward to present-day St. Louis. The Mobilian trade jargon is largely Muskogean in origin and connected most closely with the Chickasaw, Alabama, and Choctaw languages. It's a second linguistic affiliation between the Muskogean-speaking tribes and Moundville. Now I'd like to present the Choctaw-specific part of the story of how linguistic evidence connects us with Moundville. Hernando de Soto and his Spanish army were the earliest Euro-Americans to cross the Muskogean heartland. They were the first to interact with Moundville-affiliated communities, and they may have been the first to visit the settlement of Moundville itself. After entering Muskogean-speaking country from the east in October 1540, Hernando de Soto's force had a battle with the Native American polity in present-day central Alabama. And on the map there, that's the Big Eddy and Furman phases that you see. This polity was one of Moundville's daughter communities. Some of the names that De Soto recorded for this polity's eastern towns are recognizable in modern Eastern Muskogean languages, while its western towns have names that are recognizable in Choctaw. The name of this polity, as well as its paramount leader, was Tuscaloosa. The town of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, takes its name from them. Tuscaloosa means black warrior in the Choctaw and several other Muskogean languages. The battle itself took place at the Choctaw-speaking town of Mabilla. The name Mabilla comes from the Choctaw word Moili, meaning paddlers. As noted previously, the Mobilian encountered by De Soto gave rise to the Mobilian tribe of the French colonial period, which contributed to the formation of the Choctaw people. After leaving the town of Mabilla, De Soto's force traveled towards the northwest. East of the Tombigbee, they encountered the Pafalaya community, made up of multiple allied settlements. Pafalaya means long hair in Western Muskogean languages, and it was used by the Muskogean tribes to specifically refer to the Choctaw people because the Choctaw men had a custom that was locally unusual of growing their hair long. The Pafalaya community was Choctaw. Prominent anthropologist and De Soto scholar Charles Hudson asserts that the Pafalaya encountered by De Soto represented the final habitation of the Moundville community. In order, the Pafalaya towns encountered by De Soto were Talipacana. In the Choctaw language, Talipacnaca means on top of the rock. Hudson posits that it may have been the White Mound site and its associated village. This was the southernmost ceremonial center of the Moundville archaeological complex. Sebasto is a town that has been identified with Moundville itself. Archaeologists have noted the similarity between this town's name and the Choctaw word Bashto, over cup oak. Mokalisha was another town in the Pafalaya community. In the Choctaw language, Imoklasha is a contraction meaning their people lived there. In the early 1700s, Imoklasha was an ethnic group within Choctaw society. It was also a major Choctaw town. The Choctaw Imoklasha town in Mississippi is documented in the earliest French records, and it remained a significant settlement until it was decimated by smallpox in 1820. Some modern tribal members still trace part of their Choctaw identity through Imoklasha. The De Soto expedition recorded Pafalaya as the name of this polity, as the name of the town within it, as the name of the polity's leader, and as the name of the stream where the settlement was located. As I noted previously, Pafalaya was used by other tribes specifically to refer to the Choctaw people. This observation was recorded by Europeans in the early 1700s, when individuals born in the last occupation of Moundville were still alive. If Hudson is correct, the last inhabitants of Moundville were Choctaw ancestors. After leaving Pafalaya, De Soto's company headed west across the Tombigbee River. On the west side of the Tombigbee, they encountered three other Muskogean-speaking tribes, the Chickasaw, Alabama, and Choctaw, who were each related to the Choctaw and have their own ties to Moundville. The area around Moundville and the other areas where some of its daughter communities moved still have Choctaw place names on the land today. In the interest of time, I'll present just one. The Lobo Creek archaeological site, as well as several Moundville daughter communities, are located on the Tombigbee River. The Choctaw name for this river was Hatchahatok, meaning river people. It's a reference to ancestral Choctaw communities that lived there. Henry Halbert was an anthropologist who spoke Choctaw and was able to interview Choctaw people born decades before the Trail of Tears. In his opinion, the name Choctaw people have for ourselves, Choctaw, derived from Hacha and Tak, a reference to the ancestral Choctaw communities that came from the Tombigbee River. Thus, according to Henry Halbert, the foremost anthropologist of Choctaw culture in his era, even our tribe's modern name for ourselves connects us with Moundville. We're going to present geographic evidence. We've already shown that at the time of Moundville's last occupation, exclusively Muskogean-speaking tribes lived within the 140-mile radius surrounding the settlement. In the 1700s, after Moundville ceased to be inhabited, it continued to be a sacred site to the Muskogean tribes. The region surrounding Moundville became an unoccupied neutral territory located between our tribes.
Jagma, my name is Kirk Perry. I'm Chickasaw and serve as Executive Officer of the Historic Preservation Division. We appreciate the opportunity to present our joint claim and to answer your questions. The Chickasaw Nation consists of descendants of a population that lived in named towns with distinct social identities. We were once located in what is now Mississippi, Kentucky, Alabama, and Tennessee. Reitman and Wallace note that C.F.H. Claiborne in 1880 suggested that the Chickasaws had migrated into the area in waves from areas adjoining the Tennessee River in northern Alabama. Next slide. Perry and Knowles state periods of occupation have been historically documented at the Alabama-Coosa waterway via the Cahaba, Coosa, and Tallapoosa rivers from the period of occupation spanning 1720 to 1810 current era, and the period of occupation spanning 1530 to 1830 current area at the documented locations of the Black Warrior, Tombigbee Waterway on Oliver, Holt, and Bankhead Lakes, as well as the Tennessee Tombigbee Waterway on the Aliceville, Columbus, and Aberdeen Lakes, and the Canal section, Bay Springs, and the Divide Cut. Chickasaw people are an Aboriginal Southeastern First Nation who historically traveled and traded in the southeastern states from the Gulf of Mexico, Atlantic coast, and up the Mississippi. This information is depicted in this map of Chickasaw treaty cessions and removal routes of Chickasaw Indians, which also outlines our traditional hunting and trading routes. Next slide. This slide shows the same area. This is Chickasaw World in 1723. It's a deerskin map that shows our understanding of the colonial Southeast.
In 1816, the Choctaw Nation ceded the territory on which Moundville sits to the United States through the Treaty of Choctaw Trading House. As a result of this treaty, the United States government formally acknowledged that the Moundville site is located on what was Choctaw land. This has significance under NAGPRA section 10.11. However, Choctaw Nation understands that Moundville and the area around it are part of a deeper shared heritage between all of the Muskogean-speaking tribes. The Choctaw term for the Black Warrior River on which Moundville sits is Apopaka Hacha. This means boundary river, and it reflects the fact that Moundville was a neutral territory in the years after its settlement. Stepping farther back in time, I've already presented the movements of the Choctaw ancestors, and to some extent, the movements of other Muskogean-speaking tribes during the time Moundville was uninhabited under the archaeology criteria. The image that you see here is the Choctaw homeland from Choctaw Eyes in 1700, and it shows lots of different details. The areas in blue are Choctaw speaking communities. The names in red are where our neighbors lived who spoke languages other than Choctaw. The stars where Moundville is located. And in this, you can see how Moundville at this time period was on the eastern edge of Choctaw lands. You know, just to the east of that was the Muskogean and the Coushatta. and it played a role in all of our ancestral communities because it was seen as a shared sacred site. The Muskogean speaking tribes have a connection with Moundville through kinship. We consider the people of Moundville to be our direct ancestors through the kinship of the female line. In the face of dramatic population loss and conflict during the colonial period, some of the Muskogean speaking tribes formed confederations of related settlements or incorporated entire tribes into themselves to offset population loss. Many of these confederated, incorporated communities already had their own special connections with Moundville. Through these amalgamations, kinship ties Muskogean speaking tribes to Moundville in even more ways.
Kinship links the Muskogean speaking tribes to Moundville in many ways. We have shared culture, language, traditions, and maternal ancestry that ties us together and is evident at Moundville. Inheritance from a Muskogean speaking mother determines your clan, which is an important kinship in the social organization of our tribes. In the Muskogee language, your clan is referred to as Alegida, which translates to where you sit. Each clan has assigned seating and roles in the Muskogee world. This organization can be seen at Moundville. We believe our clan system existed before contact and connected us to neighboring communities and had direct ties to trade and economy in the Southeast. The clan system remains in our living culture and is not something that can be excavated. However, Moundville scholars agree that clans were connected to the placement of mounds around the central plaza. There are 29 earthen mounds arranged in pairs around the plaza, which correlates with the clan and kin groups from Moundville. The clans sit around the plaza for social and ceremonial events. Today, we see cultural continuity and have the same practice in the tribal towns of the Muskogee and Seminole Nations. We continue to gather around central plazas and ceremonial grounds according to clan and kinship. Whether it's at your own ground or town, or even if you're visiting another town, the clan system provides assigned seats. We believe that clan kinship was tied to a pair of mounds and each had a role at Moundville. Also, this social organization was the foundation to where mounds were built, who occupied the mounds, and who was buried in the mounds. Our clan system teachings also reveal that what is your role in society? Only certain clans can be Big-Ogi or chiefs, while other clans are known to be workers and warriors. Clan mothers had authority over their members and were involved in punishment and social laws. The pictures on the right showcase examples of how the clan system is used and respected in modern accounts of the Muskogee Creek Nation. The top picture is of a clan design featured at the College of the Muskogee Nation. The middle picture is from Swanton's 1912 account showing the clan seating at one of our ceremonial grounds. And at the bottom, the picture shows the clan symbols featured on top of the mound building where our National Council meets and where we have our district and Supreme Courts. Before contact, there were more than 30 clans. And although some have died out, we still recognize 16 clans in the Muskogee Creek Nation. In our department alone, we have 8 clans represented: skunk, raccoon, deer, alligator, panther, wind, bird, and bear.
Our traditional cultures discourage the exhumation and study of ancestral human remains. While information in the published literature derived from the detailed study of human remains and burials may very well connect Moundville with our tribes, we decline to submit the evidence out of respect. The Muskogee Nation presents a line of biological evidence that is not related to human remains.
The Muskogee Nation strongly condemns the use of DNA analysis on human remains in archaeological collections. Those individuals have never consented to that level of exploitation. We consider it inappropriate and against our cultural views and consider it unethical. The following slide summarizes information that focuses on mitochondrial DNA of modern populations of Muskogean speaking tribes. With each generation, mothers pass down copies of their mitochondrial DNA to their children. And unlike other parts of the genome that go through a process called recombination, mitochondrial DNA is transmitted unshuffled. And due to this pattern of inheritance, mitochondrial DNA provides specific information about maternal lineages. Next slide. While the author covers much more, she states that despite indications of genetic bottleneck that may have affected mitochondrial DNA variation in the Southeast, the haplotype networks still provide evidence of close maternal relationships among Muskogean-speaking populations. Thus, the data suggests that Muskogean populations share close mitochondrial relationships in accordance with linguistic evidence. Meaning that the evidence from living population confers that Muskogean-speaking tribes in the past were closely related kin groups. As covered in the kinship section of our presentation, our clans and towns are inherited from our mothers and are part of our modern biology. So at the cellular level, unseen until modern science, our clans and kin are not just a social organizing group, but actually contributed to and shaped our genetic composition. Next slide.
Relevant historical literature recorded mostly by Europeans in written form reflects a time period of colonial conflict, destruction, and many efforts at adapting and rebuilding on the part of Southeastern tribes. Some of these accounts date to a time when Moundville and its daughter communities were still inhabited. Some of the accounts were written by people who had little understanding of tribal cultures or languages, yet others are written by tribal people themselves. As a whole, the written accounts provide another level of information connecting each of the Muskogean-speaking tribes with Moundville-descended ancestors back into the 1500s.
These maps are of Alabama and Mississippi. In 2009, Jenkins notes that there is evidence of a connection with the Sorrels and the Somerville 4 complexes of the central Tombigbee Valley, with at least a portion of the historic Chickasaw ceramic assemblage, suggesting that James Atkinson and Jay Johnson have built a convincing case that the primary Chickasaw population moved northward out of the Tombigbee River bottoms into the Black Prairie Hills of north central Mississippi. According to Jenkins, the Somerville 4 Sorrels people were closely related to the late Moundville 3 and 4 people of the Black Warrior. And thus it appears that when the central Tombigbee River Valley was abandoned, the Alabama group, or at least part of it, moved to the upper Alabama River Valley, while the remainder of the group moved with the people of Chickasaw north into the rolling hills of the Black Prairie to become the historic Chickasaws.
Today's Muskogean-speaking tribes are heirs to the culture that our ancestors built at Moundville. Some parts of the connection are easily communicated, but other parts are best understood by the people who practice this culture themselves. For example, some of the components of traditional Muskogean religion that most strongly connect us with Moundville are not appropriate for public disclosure. Today, we're presenting snippets of the anthropological evidence that affiliates the Muskogean-speaking tribes with Moundville.
When visiting Moundville, there is a familiar feeling to the layout of the mounds to Chickasaws. Frank Speck described how Chickasaws arranged their camp or a camp square by clan subgroups in a bilateral way with a council fire in the center. James Knight noticed the similarity of Moundville layout and the camp square layout described by Speck. In 2016, C. Margaret Scarry and Vinka Stepanidis took this to its natural conclusion, quote, "But here we take his analogy one step farther. Moundville was like the Chickasaw Camp Square, not only in its layout, but also in its basic purpose as a place where people from many towns gathered for political and religious activities. In such a setting, it is not surprising that clans, which cross-cut towns, were the dominant organizational theme. We argue that Moundville was fundamentally the same as a ceremonial camp square, except larger and more permanent," end quote. The connection to modern Chickasaws through Moundville's layout is documented, and archaeologists can see the connections to the modern-day descendants of Moundville.
At no place in the United States are earth mounds more prominent than at Moundville with its 29 mounds. For Choctaw people, Moundville's earth mounds are part of a broader cultural context. Earth mounds are known as nani in the Choctaw language. The Choctaw concept of earth mounds originates with Naniwaya Chilok, a natural cave in the base of the hill, which closely resembles an earth mound. According to Choctaw origin accounts, this cave is the origin of the Choctaw people, along with the ancestors of several other Muscogean-speaking tribes. This cave was sometimes referred to as Niholitopa Ishki, beloved in Choctaw. Choctaw traditional culture is founded on respect. You show respect to the youth by helping them grow. You show respect to peers by working with them. You show respect to elders by deferring to them. Just because a person dies doesn't mean that you stop showing respect to them. Respect to the deceased is expressed by protecting the sanctity of their graves. For Choctaw people, a particular class of earth mounds is part of a much broader traditional process for paying respect to the deceased. The Choctaw ancestors built earth mounds in different ways over a period of millennia. Choctaw people continue to build them today. At the time of first sustained contact with Europe, Choctaw communities built conical earth mounds for burial, similar or identical to those built by Moundville's daughter communities on the central Alabama River. These mounds were created through a process of ceremony. After death, an individual's community spent several months in mourning. Afterwards, the deceased's prepared body was laid to rest in his community's charnel house. The community returned to pay respect to the deceased through the annual Feast of the Dead. When charnel houses became full, the ancestors were taken outside and a conical earth mound was built over them. From creation to burial, these earth mounds completed the cycle. The Choctaw word for God is Hashtali, the sun's completed order. Fire was sometimes referred to as Loak Hashtali Yit Chapa, meaning fire, the partner of God. In the past, every Choctaw community had a sacred fire. The fire was set up with 4 logs pointing outward in the cardinal directions. Here is a picket-style gorget of the type made at Moundville. The plus sign at the center represents the logs of the sacred fire, pointing in the 4 directions. The scallops in the circle outside of it represent the sun and the connection between the sun and the sacred fire. In the same way that the 4 rays extend out from the sun on this gorget, the roofs of Choctaw winter homes were divided into 4 parts to refer back to the connection with the sacred fire. No icon is more strongly connected with Moundville than the horned serpent. It began to appear on pottery made at the site in the 1300s and appears on University of Alabama advertisements for Moundville Archaeological Park today. In the Choctaw language, this being is referred to as Sinti Lapita. No icon is more representative of Moundville than the hand and eye motif depicted on a number of Moundville engraved bottles. This motif has been interpreted to come from a shared travel story of 2 brothers who travel to the west, enter a portal to the domain of the sun, and being pursued by him, cut off his hand and use it to block the portal so that he cannot follow them back to earth. In the Choctaw version of this story, the 2 protagonists are named Tushka and Wallow. The Choctaw word for west is Hashiaukatonla, meaning where the sun reclines into the water. The Choctaw word for darkness is Okselili, meaning dying in the water. Both of these terms are understood as references to the Pacific Ocean, which is located 1,900 miles from the Choctaw homeland. The story of Tushka and Wallow and these 2 common Choctaw language terms are connection between the Choctaw people and the hand and eye motif, one of the most widely recognized symbols of Moundville.
Muskogee people still honor the Bosqueda. Many people know this as the annual busk or green corn ceremony. Much like any other group of historically excluded or oppressed people, there are differing opinions on what is appropriate to share with outsiders. However, there is one story we'd like to share with you today. The following dance in English is called the Four Corners Dance. In Muskogee, it's called Kanawa Obunga. Next slide. In the dance, participants form a line, alternating genders and holding hands. The leader guides each group to each corner of the ground, each time forming a spiral. The dance is performed in honor of the 4 giant horned serpents that reside at the 4 corners of the world. Next slide. The 4 giant horned serpents represented are unseen but still honored beings that are part of the Muskogean world. Alongside pottery motifs from Moundville, we can see that the dance was incorporated into a motif. These designs were not drawn in a vacuum, and they represent what those people knew and saw. So that's why they're incorporated into the pottery. Next slide. The winged serpent is very prominently displayed at Moundville and on their pottery and are on displays in their museum. The dance demonstrates a clear modern connection to our ancestors who live at Moundville through our annual ceremonies which have endured for over 1,000 years. Next slide.
All right. The sacred fire holds our medicines in our language. The ancient names are given at this time that we carry from the time way back to today. We still carry those names, and the ceremonial scratchings that we do yearly for cleansing, and then the tobacco that we've used for building friendship, alliance building, and marriages, and trade. In the Chito Yabi, the horned snake, is the spiritual connections that we have. Is that we've always looked at our clans, the Akta Yatjalge, it's a serpent clan for the people here, and also these things are the spiritual and cultural connections that we have to Moundville. Is that we look to the future when ethical and moral paths to sacred sites will be just as sacred. Oh.
Hold on one second. Can you hear me?
We can.
Repatriation is commonly referred to as a fight for our ancestors in Indian country. I'd like you to think about that for a second. We stand before you today fighting for the return of our ancestors. Ancestors who were removed from their place of rest for purposes of what? Research? For development? And often more common yet horribly tragic, because archaeology was someone's privileged hobby. My colleagues have spent countless hours preparing for today, preparing to prove that we have the right to even be here. Let's not be mistaken. While we fight for the return of our ancestors, we are also fighting to convince you and others to accept us for who we are and who we say we are. We are the only political group in this nation who are regularly asked to prove who we are, what we believe in, and where we come from. I represent the Seminole Tribe of Florida, a people whose ancestral lands cover the southeastern United States. Our ally tribes have already shared our history with you. And what we want to punctuate is that in 2021, the United States of America has adopted strict memoranda from the highest level of office, recognizing the importance of sacred places, sacred sites, as well as tribal consultation. It should be evident that the return of our ancestors is in alignment with those priorities. Our ancestors died for us so that we may live. Our ancestors' lives represent the traditional knowledge and way of life that requires us to take care of and responsibility for our ancestors. So we stand before you today as the warriors of the 21st century. We are fighting for our ancestors because until they rest, we are still at war. Thank you.
I want to extend our sincerest appreciation for hearing summaries of our lines of evidence and the heartfelt messages that you've heard today. Yokoki. Ahead of this presentation, I prepared a comprehensive timeline for your review that included shared documents. And while I cannot summarize 8 long decades of history in a very few short minutes, I would like to touch upon relevant events that are essential to understanding our collective history of consultation with the University of Alabama. Between 1929 and 1941, the Moundville Archaeological Park was created from excavations within our ancestors' cemetery. Hundreds to thousands of our ancestors were removed from their final resting place, their remains and funerary items displayed in facilities to showcase to the public. This was done without consultation with descendant communities. Over the course of the next 76 years, over 200 articles are published on the study of our ancestors, most after the passing of NAGPRA in the late 1990s, leading to present day. This was done without consultation with the tribes. In 1997, the University of Alabama submitted their inventory to National NAGPRA, and the president of the university invited tribes to consult on cultural affiliation. This consultation has not occurred. Between 2009 and 2011, both the Chickasaw Nation and the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma signed memorandum of understanding with the university. Both documents laid out binding commitments leading to repatriation for both parties, including productive consultation, information sharing, and the respectful treatment of ancestral human remains. The tribes fulfilled their commitments. The University of Alabama did not. Over the last decade, the Muskogean tribes have repeatedly reached out to the University of Alabama for requests for consultation, information sharing, dates to meet in person or virtually with leadership and the elusive UA Committee on Human Remains. Tribes submitted multiple claims for ancestors from adjacent archaeological sites. One such claim to note, in 2015, the Chickasaw Nation sent their first CUI claim to the University of Alabama for archaeological sites in northern Alabama counties. The notice of inventory completion was published 4 years later in August 2019, only after consistent follow-up. In this notice, only 32 associated funerary items were noted because the university was unable to locate the other 277 funerary items originally discussed, yet none of the funerary items were actually returned to their community for reburial. This is just one example in a series of disappointments for tribes. It became common to learn that both our ancestors and their funerary items were missing or regularly handled and studied as part of teaching collections or student research. Their belongings were left out on tables, displayed openly on desktop computers, and exhibited in the museum adjacent to their repository. While touring the repository, tribes witnessed deplorable curation standards with ripped brown paper bags spilling our ancestors' burial fill onto the facility floor, and an array of unorganized 5-gallon buckets filled with ancestors awaiting inventory. The level of disrespect is unimaginable. With heavy hearts, tribes continued to press forward, reaching out to university staff for updates and requests for consultation. In 2018, the tribes listened to the proposed 5-year re-inventory plan of our shared ancestors. The University of Alabama Office of Archaeological Research representatives told the tribes in correspondence, quote, "The university places its own value on these remains. The remains are unique sources of information," end quote. Further, Office of Archaeological Research Director Eugene Furtado stated, quote, "These remains have much to teach us about the lives of these individuals, and we believe that it is important to learn as much of that story as possible prior to transfer," end quote. Infuriated, tribes did not consent to this re-inventory or further study. The same year, we learned that the University of Alabama considers 10.11 unconstitutional. Therefore, reluctantly, they have agreed to return our shared ancestors only after their study. However, they will exercise their right to retain all funerary items. Tribes were hopeful for a path forward when we received monthly progress updates. Then, in October of 2019, all consultation ended. The tribes learned secondhand the osteologist performing the reassessment retired and work had stopped. The tribes are still awaiting updates. Hopefully this gives you a brief synopsis of our collective consultation history today. I know that based on our time here today, the next question for you is obvious. Did the university consult on cultural affiliation specifically? And I offer you this. Over the last decade, the University of Alabama has invited all of the Muskogean tribes to participate in yearly activities by way of their annual Native American Festival, including in their own advertisements, a direct statement to our cultural affiliation. Each October, descendants of this vibrant cultural return, celebrating the South's rich Indian heritage at the award-winning Moundville Native American Festival. Tribal representatives regularly give classroom presentations throughout the year. We give brown bag lunch presentations, participate in lecture series with archaeological field school students, and give demonstrations on our culture and traditional arts. Tribes have assisted with student research projects, collaborated with professors on course content, and consistently worked to shape interpretation of Muskogean traditions of the past. This month, as a matter of fact, the University of Alabama reached out to tribes for submissions to their film festival held on campus. The Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma featured 4 short films, including one on the significance of Muskogean tribes to the Moundville ancestors. My point is simple. By inviting Muskogean tribes for the last decade to participate in demonstrating to the general public or millions of visitors to the state of Alabama, our heritage and our connection to Moundville, it is clear the University of Alabama has already made their decision on cultural affiliation.
We would like to end by briefly considering the way that cultural affiliation is conceived of. The last occupation at Moundville was contemporaneous with the occupation of another famous community, the Plymouth Bay Colony, founded by the Pilgrims. The land on which Plymouth Colony sits is no longer in the hands of the same nation that owned it when the settlement was founded. None of the original occupants of Plymouth Colony became American citizens in their lifetime. The United States has expanded and incorporated to the point that its center of population is now located more than 1,000 miles from Plymouth Colony. There's no clear visual similarity between the type of ceramics used by the Plymouth colonists and the eating dishes used by the average American today. Despite these and many other changes through time, no one seriously questions Plymouth Colony's cultural affiliation with the United States. In 30 years of NAGPRA cultural affiliation determinations, any evidence at all of change or development on the part of Native American communities through time has routinely been used to argue that modern communities are somehow not affiliated with our own ancestors. Yet NAGPRA itself specifies that cultural affiliations determinations are to be based on preponderance of evidence, meaning 51%. The claimant tribes have presented substantial evidence of cultural affiliation under every criteria given by NAGPRA. Through archaeology, we've laid out the specific archaeological phases and ceramic types that affiliate us with Moundville. We've shared oral traditions that place our ancestors in the Moundville region since before Moundville was founded and connect us with developments that happened at Moundville itself. We've demonstrated not only that the last inhabitants of Moundville spoke a Muskogean language, but in fact that no tribes other than Muskogean speakers lived anywhere within a 140-mile radius of Moundville during its final occupation. For more than a century after its occupation, Moundville was understood to be a central, neutral, sacred site between the Muskogean peoples, highlighting our joint affiliation with it. The Muskogean tribes trace our lineage to Moundville through the kinship of the female line. We've demonstrated that our traditional religions, dances, and ceremonies explain the meanings behind the iconography that Moundville is still known for today. Moundville is at least as closely affiliated with the Muskogean tribes as Plymouth Colony is to the United States. Through this presentation, as well as the documents submitted to National NAGPRA, we believe we've provided not just preponderance of evidence, but evidence beyond reasonable doubt in every category provided by NAGPRA that the Muskogean-speaking tribes are culturally affiliated with Moundville. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you'll just give me a minute to change the view settings.
Well, while Melanie's doing that, on behalf of the committee, I want to thank all of the presenters for a very interesting set of presentations that was clear, detailed, and as I said, and very interesting. I'm sure there are some questions. Madam DFO, is now the time to do that?
Yeah.
Note that we are nearly halfway through. We could start some questions, discussion, and then take a break in 15 minutes or so, or and then continue with questions after that, or comments.
Yeah, so not quite halfway. We're an hour in, and we do have some time for discussion. I would suggest maybe just take a 5-minute break as everybody has been listening intently, to allow everyone to at least turn off their cameras for a moment, especially the presenters, before the discussion begins. Would that be okay,
Yeah.
Mr. Chair?
I think that sounds fine. I see some nodding of heads here on the
Okay,
screen. So
we'll
let's do
come
that.
back in
Five
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, everyone, if you could please rejoin the meeting. Thank you. Shelby, there we go. Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Chair, I'll turn the discussion over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam DFO. So I'm going to invite the review committee members to comment or ask questions of our presenters about the information, the evidence that they've discussed. Who would like to be the first? Well, let me start then. The shy bunch of review committee members here, I think, but I'm sure they'll get warmed up as we move through this. In any case, as I said, thanks very much for your clear and detailed presentations of evidence supporting cultural affiliation with the Muskogean-speaking tribes and Moundville and the adjacent communities. I thought there really is a lot of evidence to support that. I have a couple of questions, if I could ask, and these relate mainly to the archaeological evidence. My question is, can those of you who have looked in detail at the archaeological evidence sort of summarize the physical evidence that connects the various phases of Moundville with the out-migration communities that you showed over time? What specific physical evidence are there? I expect that would include pottery styles. It might include other types of ceremonial artifacts and things of that sort. But could somebody, not in agonizing detail, but sort of as examples, show that kind of connection?
Certainly. So the history that we've presented, of course, is very complex. We're talking a long span of time. We're talking multiple daughter communities interacting. But I'll be glad to give you a core part of that archaeological physical evidence. At Moundville, the archaeological phases go Moundville 1 through 4. There was a significant out movement of people from Moundville in late Moundville 3 to the Central Alabama River Valley. This gave rise to the Durant Bend phase and the Foreman phase. When these people moved out of Moundville, one of their diagnostic ceramic types was Carthage incised. It's a distinctive type of bowl. It's burnished. It's got wide incised lines. When this community moved to the Central Alabama River Valley, that same type of pottery continued to be made. Ultimately, it transformed with some influences from other Moundville-derived communities in the Mobile Bay area into Pensacola incised varieties of pottery. They look very similar to the Moundville 3 pottery. The motifs are identical. The vessel shapes are often what are called wide mouth bowls. Sometimes they're called flaring rim bowls, another style. The Pensacola style of pottery ultimately gave rise to its antecedent. This was Wilcox incised. It was part of the Little phase in Central Alabama River Valley, also Western Alabama. This type of pottery has fine markings on the rim. They're called notched rims. It's actually present in Matthews Landing pottery too. The Little phase ceramics are sand tempered, but they keep similar motifs. They keep the notched rim like the earlier pottery from the Matthews Landing phase. That nicked rim incised pottery is also the earliest pottery at Choctaw settlements in Mississippi, dating to the 1600s. It's by far the most common decorated type there. That Little pottery also gave rise to Fort Dauphin incised. That variety of pottery is associated with the Mobilian tribe from the 1700s on Mobile Bay. The nicked rim variety also gave rise to Dr. Lake and size ceramics. And this type of ceramic is culturally affiliated with the Tahomey and the Nani Aba. And both the Tahomey and Nani Aba, like the Mobilians, spoke the Choctaw language, had Choctaw culture, and ultimately amalgamated with the Choctaw people. So that's one archaeological ceramic chronology. We could talk about others too, if you would like.
Thank you. Thank you. And the nature of the nature of the cultural process in terms of the physical artifacts appearing in the new sites. Those are the sites are actually new settlements. Is that correct? It's not trade, but it's actually people moving.
I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt. But yes, these are new sites. For example, the Bottle Creek site, it dates to 1100. It's on Mobile Bay, and it's intrusive. You know, suddenly it's Moundville pottery that appears there. There's no local woodland antecedent, and those settlements don't have much woodland pottery. It's just suddenly Moundville pottery there. Something similar on the Central Alabama River Valley. You know, it's just, there were some groups in that area, but just suddenly it's this massive population movement out of Moundville with classic late Moundville 3 ceramics. It's a movement of people there. Now, in both cases, those communities maintain contacts with Moundville, but they both started as a population movement that stayed put.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody else want to comment? The presenters?
Yes, this is Turner Hunt. I just wanted to say that both reiterate what he was talking about on the Upper Alabama. You know, it was a population that moved in a point intrusion, as well as the Ebert Canebrake site, because that was actually in the middle of the Shine 2 phase. So in the midst of Shine 2, there was a site in the middle of it that was Moundville derivatives. I'd also like to point out that prior to being named Moundville 4, the phase was known as the Alabama River phase in Alabama. And prior to that, it was known as the burial urn culture. And that was defined in the Upper Alabama area. So all of those things come together to really paint that picture.
Thank you. Thank you. And let me just ask this one follow-up on that. There's, is there any professional disagreement about this? That both the fact that the you know, the connection between Moundville and these new style or special style artifacts in these additional sites, or the idea that it was populations moving. This is sort of the general interpretation within the community, both the specialists and generalists.
Yes, for the most part it is. A lot of what we've presented is work based on what Ned Jenkins has presented, particularly for Alabama. In the Choctaw case, ethnohistories haven't been done going back before European contact outside of the tribe. So the particular connection between the nicked rim and size pottery, Central Alabama River Valley, and Mississippi has been noted by archaeologists. It's been published, but it hasn't been discussed much. However, other ceramic types and affiliations, such as the Bottle Creek site and its affiliation with the Naniaba and Tahomey, are widely accepted by archaeology. And I don't want to speak for Muskogee Nation, but the chronologies they presented are widely accepted.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Other review committee members, you have questions you'd like to ask or comments? Tim.
I just have a general question as a non-archaeologist, so explain it to me in simple terms. From the earliest occupation of that particular site until the abandonment in the historic period, does the archaeological record show that the site was generally occupied continually through that period, or are there any breaks?
The Moundville site was continuously occupied from about 1020 AD until about 1650. During that time, different daughter communities moved out, but the site continued to be inhabited. As time, at first it was a major population site living within Moundville itself. As time went along, communities moved to the adjacent areas on the Black Warrior, and Moundville became a ceremonial center that was still inhabited, but the major population areas moved just outside of it, say in the 1400s. But it was continuously occupied all the way to 1650.
So the archaeological record doesn't indicate that there was any period of hiatus in there.
No, not between 1020 and 1650.
Thank you. Let me just follow up on that. Roughly speaking, of the human remains and funerary objects that we're discussing here, does the majority of them, would they all date post that 1020 period?
To the best of our knowledge, yes, they do.
Thank you.
Thanks. Shelby and then John. You have questions, comments?
Yes, I have a question primarily just for clarification, because I see in all the documentation here, we're referring to the Moundville Archaeological Site 1 TU 500. And on the maps, you had a number of different sites. Are those all within that, what you're referring to as the Moundville site?
No, they're not. So there's a Moundville settlement located on the Black Warrior River and immediately adjacent daughter communities within just a few miles of it. But the larger area that we were showing on that map was Moundville's daughter communities and culturally connected communities, but they're
Okay,
not all Moundville per se.
okay, thank you.
John.
Yes, thank you. My question goes to start talking about people. And so you talk about we can start talking about Moundville primarily, but then as you venture out, you mentioned daughter communities, you've mentioned Moundville as a major population site. So in terms of people and numbers, what's a rough what is a rough estimate of the population number one there at Moundville? And then as you get into the later parts, if you talk about the migrations out of Moundville, a rough maybe even just a rough estimate projection of the number of peoples that are starting to go out. Because my question being, as we come into from that time period into for those who are certainly maybe interested into the historic time period, and to really, my question is that to just sort of lay out that we're not talking about an insignificant number of people at these sites that we're talking about, one at Moundville, and then as people start to migrate out from there. So what is might be the projected sort of population numbers at Moundville, and then as they start migrating out to these daughter communities, and even into and then a question to even into the more historic periods when we're talking about these tribal towns, how many people are living in those tribal towns or those daughter communities? You have some information on that?
We have some information to share. Moundville reached its densest population early in its settlement history. There are estimates that the site had 3,000 people living at it, but it could have been more. There's disagreement in archaeologists. 3,000 may be a minimum figure. But the area immediately adjacent to Moundville had a population that's estimated to be about 10,000 at that time. These groups that moved out, some of them were quite large. I'm not directly aware of archaeological estimates of how many people lived in the Bottle Creek phase sites or the Ramp Bend phase sites, but it was substantial. And for example, when Hernando de Soto visited the Durant and Furman phase sites, he encountered thousands of people living there that spoke Muscogean languages.
follow up
Yes, John, please.
to that. So since we're talking about not an insignificant number of people here through this particular time period that we're examining, that's so when a major population moves out, they're taking the culture, the culture with them to these daughter sites or these new communities that are established. That's what you're presenting, right? That's what you're saying.
Yes.
One of the things you're saying, yes. And so that, I guess that goes to say too, that when you have a large number of people, living at Moundville and then large numbers moving out, we're not talking about a disappearance of a people that just suddenly disappear from the archaeological or historic or anthropological record, and then all of a sudden reappear. That's what we're talking about here too, correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. John? Sorry.
That's all I have for the moment.
Okay. Honor, I think I see your hand up.
Hello, thank you everyone for your presentation. It's good to see you all. And I look forward to more discussion. My questions go toward the consultation process in particular. Could you share in a little bit more detail what the consultation process has been like in particular over the past 6 years? And my second question is, do you have knowledge of any of how your ancestors and cultural items have or have not been cared for during that time? During your presentation, we heard some awful descriptions of how your ancestors and cultural items have been treated over the past several decades. And it was very disturbing as an Indigenous person to hear that. And my last question has to do with whether or not through the consultation process or lack thereof, whether or not tests are currently being done on your ancestors and cultural items. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Honor. And I'll try to, again, give a synopsis. There's a lot of history there. And, unfortunately, we don't know what the curation standards are currently today. I mentioned a couple different things that we've experienced over the course of consultation starting and touring the facility. I know for us here at the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, a lot of our interaction in terms of specifically working towards consultation, since 2016 revolved around the TVA, which is the Tennessee Valley Authority. Their collections were housed at the repository there at the University of Alabama at the Office of Archaeological Research. Through their grant funding, through their funds, those particular ancestors were re-inventoried and put in curation properly, curation standard, up to curation standards. And so that was part of our initial tour of this facility, was coming to see that done. And we noticed that our ancestors that are not part of the TVA collection were being mismanaged. So in light of that, that's how I think that, I came on board. I can speak for myself, and of course, our other tribal partners can share their history. I know that for myself, when I came on board about 5 or 6 years ago, that is something that I started with, was the TVA and going to those consultations. The courts have always, the tribes have always been in consultation in terms of trying to get that door open with the University of Alabama, in terms of trying to find out who is it exactly that makes the decisions for consultation or cultural affiliation or repatriation process. And we were referred to the University of Alabama Committee on Human Remains. This committee took the information that was presented to them, any claims, any information, and then took it to this committee, and then they would go ahead and move that forward to the university president and leadership at the university. That was our process of understanding of how that went. And so, as I mentioned in my portion of the presentation today, that it was really in 2018 that we understood a little bit more about their process and what they wanted to do in terms of a re-inventory. The re-inventory would include looking at other collections there at the university. We were made aware of teaching collections. You know, me being new to NAGPRA work, I didn't understand what teaching collections were. And we were explained that this was when professors needed teaching materials for their classroom. And so they would go and they would choose elements of our ancestors to take into the classroom. They did not keep records of this. And so the university was working toward inventorying these individuals as best they could without records. So these got included into what was called a 5-year re-inventory. We learned that they didn't really have intentions of changing a lot of the numbers with National NAGPRA. It was more of a, you know, it came out through correspondence and follow-ups and persistence that the university really wanted to study our ancestors prior to their return. At this time, we know, you know, I don't know for sure, but we have had correspondence over the last year and confirmation from Matt Gage, who's at the University of Alabama Office of Archaeological Research, that no further work has been authorized. A couple years ago, one of the professors was finishing up his, you know, master students and then turning all of his students away from research on osteological collections. And so we know that, you know, there were steps there. However, you know, speaking just for the Chalk Foundation of Oklahoma, we haven't been to tour the facility. We haven't been on site. We haven't got any research requests or know of anything offhand, but it has been told to us and conveyed that there are no longer any research being done on our ancestors. So I'll invite other tribal partners to share their portion. Hopefully that answered your question, Honor.
Thank you, Deanna.
Just to say a little bit more over time, the university seems to have a committee, but the committee doesn't meet regularly, and that committee is who's in charge of repatriation. So we send a repatriation request that goes to the committee, but they don't meet and they don't make any decisions. So it's been very difficult to figure out what can we do to make the committee to move forward and take an action. And we don't have any records from that committee. We don't have any rules. We don't have any policies. It's just the way it goes. And so it's always kind of a question about what should we do or how can we move forward? Mm-hmm. We realize, all of us do, that COVID did slow the process down some. And that was part of the reason we were told that they couldn't finish our inventory, because they didn't have anybody working. But now that they've opened back up, they should be able to do work. And then over time, the osteologists quit, and some of the other people who are a little bit older, they've quit too. So now we're still at the same place. We have a claim in. It's been quite a while, but we still don't have an official response. And we were hopeful that we would get a response from the university when we made this claim.
I appreciate that very much. And I think some of these questions we would, or, you know, be the sort of question we might ask of the University of Alabama and the departments there who are in charge of caring for the remains at this point. But let me ask for those the presenters a question that really it's what's your understanding, I guess would be the way to phrase it, of the re-inventory that the university is is doing? Was the first inventory incomplete, or do you know why they're doing that or what they're doing? Maybe, perhaps not, because it sounds like they haven't been very communicative, but I figured you might know better than we would.
I can take a shot at it. What we explained to you that we were working with the Tennessee Valley Authority, who has a large collection that's housed at the university at Moundville at the OAS. So as they went through all of their collections, TBA, they started discovering that the university has started finding things that they didn't know they had, parts of those collections. So as we would complete a repatriation with TBA for a particular collection and finish it and be ready to take control, we would get a call from them. Well, the university found some more people, some more human remains. And so then that would cause TBA to slow down and recount and find out how many more people belonged in that collection. So that's an example of what we're talking about University of Alabama saying, hey, we don't know what we've got. We got to go back and count them again. And with COVID starting, that was part of them saying it's going to take us 5 years. So we can't say exactly where they are, but we hope that they've got some progress.
Thank you. Thank you.
I will add on to what Kirk said, is that one of the things that was of interest to us that we had initially asked for and during the initial phases of consultation of this re-inventory was, if they were able to remarry all of the funerary items of these individuals, because we are aware, we have been told that all of the items in the museum there on property have been excavated from funerary context. And so it was our hope that they would be able to reunite the records, at least during this process. However, that's not the case. In other attempts, there were consultations that were done in section 106, where mounds had weather incidents, where mounds were sloughing and human remains were washed out during storms. We have repeatedly asked for inventories of these ancestors that were washed out so that we could continue to be kept in the loop. But it just seems like a process where we're constantly comparing numbers to what was published in 1997, and then also these new kind of vague records that are coming out, and then asking about which individual do these funerary items belong to, and we're not getting any answers.
Thank you. Thank you. Other committee members have questions? I've got one more. John, go ahead. Yeah, I think you need to unmute them.
There you go. Thank you. So with the, and I regret earlier, I got ahead of myself. I did want to thank everyone for your presentations today. So I want to thank you for that and the material that you've submitted to the review committee, which is very extensive, and the public is certainly open to view that material that's been submitted to us so they can see what they see what we're seeing. But with that, the question about the ancestors, the human remains in question, and the funerary objects. I know there was, based on one of the comments just a second ago, there was something about perhaps trying to connect some of the funerary objects to particular individuals or not. But my question is, and for the benefit of everyone who may be listening, so the individuals, particularly from Moundville, that are represented in this, perhaps the question before us, and along with the human remains, they all come from the same sites and follow the sequence that's being presented in the presentations. Could you, excuse me, could you elaborate on that? Could you elaborate on that further. So it's not like there's a great mystery between the human remains and the funerary objects, even though some of those funerary objects may not have an individual that they can be directly associated with. They do, if I'm reading this correctly, understanding you correctly, they do come from the same site, follow the same sort of time periods that we're looking at, and come from the same, the remains and the funerary come from the same context. So if you could you clarify that and expound on that a little or somewhat?
Yes, absolutely. So yes, all of the funerary items and all of the individuals that are there on site are from the Moundville Archaeological Site. When I was talking about remarrying or reuniting those records, that was the tribe's attempt to work with the university, because we were initially told that because these funerary items were taken out of those contexts, they're no longer with these individuals, they could not provide records to us that there was a shared link to them, even though they were from the site. So that was our attempt as tribes to kind of circumvent that and work with the university and say, okay, let's have as much records and we'll try to do that. But yes, to clarify, all of the ancestors that we are presenting on for a finding of fact for cultural affiliation and their funerary items are from this location, from the Moundville site.
Thank you. Okay, let's see, I have two more. Shelby and then Tim.
Thank you. And I failed to also thank all of you for your presentations. Very useful and welcoming information. Thank you. I have kind of a follow-up question. It's sounding to me like the funerary objects are currently housed at the Moundville Park, and then the human remains are housed at the university. Is that correct? Am I understanding that? So that the university is arguing that since they are not able to associate the funerary objects with the ancestral remains at the university, that they're not part of the collection. Is that my understanding, that that's why they don't feel they should be repatriated, or am I understanding this correctly?
So there's definitely part of a broad history here that you're talking about. Some of it goes back to the Moundville Museum, which Kirk was involved in the consultations on that. But, you know, this was maybe 12, 13 years ago, and the tribes consulted at that time with the university and made it clear that they did not wish for funerary objects to go on display there. But ultimately, the university put hundreds of funerary objects on display there from Moundville. In terms of repatriating those or repatriating other funerary objects from Moundville, we can't speak for the university, but they have told us before that they consider Section 10.11 to be unconstitutional.
Interesting. Thank you.
Tim, why don't you go next, and then John?
Thanks. I'm trying to get my head around the claim history. I know from the documentation that Muskogee Nation made a claim in 2018, which they responded to, correct? Did they respond to that claim?
Our 2018 claim,
Yes.
we've made several claims. What, for Moundville specifically?
Yes.
No, I don't think we have received a response.
I guess the one that kind of confuses me is I think the June 2021 claim, which was specifically for Moundville. In the materials, there's a date for a response from the university on that one. But when I click on the link, it looks like it's a letter from you back to them. So what was the nature of that response?
I think the 2018 correspondence is relating to the procedures of re-inventorying the collection.
I see. I'm just reading the September 2021. University of Alabama responded that they received the joint Moundville claim. They did not discuss arrangements for transfer or control / disposition of the ancestors, nor set up a date for consultation to discuss the claim doing so. But when I click on that link, it actually goes to a letter, I think, from you back to them. So I'm trying to get a grasp of what their response was.
Are you trying to, just to clarify, this is Deanna. Are you trying, Mr. McGowan, to get understanding of what the response was to our June 2020 claim?
Correct.
2021 claim?
Well, actually the 2018 one as well, because my understanding from reading the documentation is at some point, my recollection is at one of the claims, they said, no, these are not culturally affiliated. And we think the CUI regs are unconstitutional. And at some point, it sounds like they changed their position on the human remains, that they were willing to have a disposition of those, but still not be culturally affiliated, to have them as culturally unidentifiable. And then you filed the 2021 claim, and it looks from the chronology list like they responded. But when I click on the link in the documentation, it doesn't go to their response. It goes to something you sent back to them.
And I
So
apologize.
that confuses me.
Yeah, and I apologize for that. That was an error on my part. I was in charge of getting those links together. So that was an error in terms of getting their response. In 2018, you're correct. They did change their stance on, but they did let us know that they felt that 10.11 in that documentation, you can see in the correspondence that's there from the representatives, talks about how they view that 10.11 is unconstitutional. They did make a change in their position in terms of willingness to return or transfer of control for our ancestors. However, they did talk that at that time that they were going to retain their funerary items. Then again in 2021 in June, their response was that they received the correspondence basically. There wasn't a date to set up for consultation or discuss disposition. The key here though is that throughout this process, there wasn't actually a discussion on cultural affiliation. In 1997, there was never a discussion with tribes about cultural affiliation, and we haven't had those talks about cultural affiliation. This is something that the university has determined. So they were sharing in that correspondence their viewpoints with us.
And when they changed their position on the human remains, that they were willing to transfer those to your control based on the CUI rules on the 10.11. You didn't pursue that, is that correct? Because
Yes, that's correct.
you're holding out that they're culturally affiliated, so.
We've always held the position that they're culturally affiliated.
Right. I'm just trying to get a grasp of the back and forth. I also noticed that in the newspaper, it says that there was a meeting last week. Can you share anything from that? I think
Sure,
the quote,
I can
the
help.
quote in the newspaper from them is consistent with these ongoing efforts. The university made Muskogee Nation leaders aware in a meeting this morning of our desire to further collaborate on their most recent joint request related to Moundville.
Yes, Mr. Gowan, we did meet with the leadership of the University of Alabama. The president of the university was not able to attend due to a personal matter, but the leadership that were there told us that they did receive our claim and that they would be responding by letter in a few days following the meeting. and that they were completing inventories and that they would be starting consultation soon. And we wanted to talk more about NAGPRA, but was kind of told that it wasn't a right time, or the meeting wasn't to talk about these kind of issues. And so we waited patiently for a letter from the university outlining what the next steps would be, a timeline of how things are going, and more transparency and ultimately consultation. But we still have not received any direct responses to those questions.
Do you feel that
So
the
this is
university?
Amber.
Oh, sorry.
To add on to what Raylan was saying, this is Amber Hood. I work with Chickasaw Nation, and I am one of the ones that began initiating consultation with them in 2014, and we sent our claim in 2015. And I can say that that has been the exact same letter and stance that we've got anytime we've requested consultation, is we get a letter thanking us for it and saying we'll talk soon, and then it's never been a good time. So that's been consistent since 2014.
This
Thank
is
you.
Tina Osceola with the Seminole Tribe, and it's the same exact story with us. We waiting on consultation. It's promised, but it never actually happens. We'll send letters. Sometimes they're answered. Other times the answer is, we'll be answering later. No, and so it's just nothing but strategies on their part to stall.
Thank you all for weighing in on that important point. John, do you have a question or a comment?
Yes, both perhaps question and comment. So I was going to follow up on a bit, or maybe just an observation on some of Tim's previous question, because you had stated somewhere in, I guess in maybe it was in the more recent past, that there had been that the university, at least at this had at one was perhaps putting forth or offering the return of the ancestors, but not the that was sort of where it dropped off, the ancestors, but not the funerary objects, the funerary that go with these collections. And so that's sort of, it's to where I'm at. This sort of brings us to where we are. One of the points that sort of brings us to where we are today, if I'm correct. It's not putting those two very important components together to reunite those collections. Is that am I correct in assuming that, or is my perception on that correct in that?
Yes.
I see some head shaking.
Yeah, sorry. We're kind of
That's
having
okay.
to share a camera here.
No, that's okay.
yes,
That's
that is-
okay.
That is why we're here today.
Right. And so that goes to it goes to another point that I've as I was going through the extensive materials that have been provided. One, speaking to the history of the somewhat the extensive or the long-term history in the consultation process, if you will. But I did want to, and it was very interesting towards the end of the presentation that you brought up the public facing side of things in terms of the, I would say the program that goes on at the site and perhaps at the museum itself. And that was something that I had a particular, I don't know if it's so much a question or an observation. It seemed like you'd hit on something that I had a question about too. And to me, it's something it speaks to that. You were talking about cultural affiliation, excuse me, that whether formal or informal, a decision seemed to have been made a long time ago. In terms of those presentations there, in terms of whether it's directly stated or not. I mean, the consultation process, at least on the public facing side with the museum and the collections, and has been with the, I'm a number of the tribes who are represented here during the meeting today. And you provided one substantial information about the discussions that occurred during the lead up to the new exhibits that are there. But I think it's a really, particularly on the public facing side of things, and for those who have visited the site in more recent years, recent days, and it seems like there was a lot of wording in there that did acknowledge, and if those who want to, particularly in the PowerPoint presentation, the first slide, the PowerPoint presentation that was put forth about the new exhibits. I mean, it does directly say that about the tribal nations who are represented here are the descendants of the perhaps, you know, the peoples who are represented, the human remains and the collections. And so to me, wasn't lost on when I was going through this also that the public programming in recent years has continually invited the members of all these of the tribal communities who are on the presentation today. So it seems like that to backtrack me a little bit, it does seem like that, as I was saying, it does seem like a decision was made very early on, at least on the public facing side of things, that acknowledges the long-term representation of the tribal nations who are of those who are present. Is that correct? And to my knowledge, we've had members of pretty much a number of the tribal nations who are presented here who have and continue to go in recent years. So I guess my observations, and it seems like it's yours as well, your comment as well, is that you keep being invited to these public presentations, but why are you being invited if you're not in some way culturally affiliated to the culture that's represented or presented there at the site? I mean, I think that, I mean, while it doesn't speak to sort of the languaging or the conversations that you've had or perhaps you've had with the in terms of the repatriation process, that is in some ways an acknowledgement to cultural affiliation, or right, at least on the public facing side.
I'll just speak for myself and what I share, but yes, that is my impression. And, you know, it's been our experience here at the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma to welcome those collaborations with students, with professors. You know, one of the remarks that was given to me, I won't name their name, but the person that inquired about short films to provide for the film festival on campus this month, when I shared with them the video about you know, the Muskogean tribes and their affiliation and connection with Moundville and the importance of our heritage, you know, he was like, great, this is perfect. So I think that there is that decision, like you said, that's unspoken.
Why would you be invited? Why would you be invited if there's not a possibility that there doesn't exist a possibility that these communities are in some way affiliated to the site? Is that and to your point, and Mr. Perry, you may be able to speak to some of this as well. In the information that has been provided to the review committee and for the greater public to see, it seems like, I want to say about 8 or 9 years ago, there was some discussion about in the production of videos, a series of videos or something like that were supposed to be a part of the exhibits. And there was some comment in there that we have that actually exists in the record that was provided to the review committee by I think a staff person there who was working on the project at the time, that said, we want the greater public to know, or we don't want the project to stop or the presentation to stop at abandonment, because there's a great more history for the greater public to know in the 500 years post that particular time period, and we certainly want to know that these people didn't sort of disappear off the face of the map. Is that I don't mean to paraphrase too much, but that is the substance of that conversation in those email correspondence, if I'm correct.
That's hard to say. Generally speaking, the Chickasaws have worked with the university who's got archaeological collections from around the whole state. So when we've done repatriations before, it's not just Moundville. So the repatriation we mentioned in the presentation, we put a claim in 2015 and we were asking for some collections in northwestern Alabama. And we consulted on them, and it took them 4 years to decide that yes, they could repatriate the human remains. And as we told you, no, they would not repatriate the funerary objects. So for us, it was sad, but we felt compelled that we wanted to go ahead and take those people and get them reburied. And whatever the university decides is up to its leaders. We've been told over a period of years that they are not going to repatriate the funerary objects from Moundville. That's what they've told us. Moundville is a big cemetery. And, they can dig almost anywhere and they're going to find human remains. And those objects they dig up from those graves, I mean, there are thousands of them in those collections. Not recently, but in a few years ago, we've been in the repository, and what we saw was boxes stacked on shelves that the shelves were falling in, and the boxes were coming apart. And it was not very good. And since the repository is responsible also for some federal collections that are stored there, the university did come back and make that better. Fix the shelves and put collections in proper boxes, all that sort of stuff. So because their collection is very large, it makes it difficult for them to keep up with how many human remains they've got, keep up with all the archaeology they've got, and with the new objects that they're collecting all the time. So for all of us to not have a correct inventory, or to have an inventory that was done in consultation, we've told you that too. It was just done, and the university will tell us, well, a long time ago we did it, and we did that in consultation, but the tribes didn't know what is in the collection. And even when we came back to say, hey, we want to repatriate this collection, for example, the teaching collection, the university said, hey, we don't know how many human remains that even represents. So yeah, we'll consider repatriating it. They're just bones, but it's going to take us a while to recount those. And so that's another example of a repatriation request that's out there. We have no idea if they'll ever respond. So that's an example of what makes all this confusing.
Thank you. Thank you for your response, Mr. Perry. I guess back to my question is that for those of you who the presenters here who have visited the museum in I would say in more recent years, weeks, months, COVID notwithstanding. So I guess I'm going back to the presentations that perhaps someone not experienced or versed in the language that we're talking about today, but if you're going there and visiting the museum, or if not the museum, other public presentations and seeing what's out there, to what degree or to what extent, because it sounds like there was a consultation process that took place between the university / museum and the descendant communities or the tribal nations. So how much of that is reflected in the current exhibits? And because to me that would be, can anyone speak to that?
Deanna, I'll start. Yes, the university did invite us to come in and consult on the design of the museum. And one of the conflicts we had was the funerary objects. So in consultation, we asked that they not display the funerary objects in the museum. And after we left and came back and saw the finished museums, we saw funerary objects being on display, and it was very disheartening. But on the other hand, you have a museum that's open to the public, and it does show how Moundville might have been during the time when it was very active. So the part that troubles me a little bit is that that museum is on a burial ground, and those human remains came from right underneath the museum. Some of those funerary objects came from right under the museum. And we were told that we could rebury those human remains right there in those graves, but that never happened. The museum actually left an opening, a door in the floor so that they could do that, but they never used it. They changed their mind.
So the quote that was in my portion of the presentation and the slide was taken directly from the advertisement, the brochure that goes out to the public nationwide. And it states, and I'll read it again, each October, descendants of this vibrant culture return, celebrating the South's rich Indian heritage at the award-winning Moundville Native American Festival, end quote. This has been something since I started 7 years ago with the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma Historic Preservation Department. That's been a pride for us to go and share our heritage. We have this award-winning cultural center that just opened up. Many of our other tribal partners regularly share their heritage. We're a living, breathing culture, and we have many participants in our community that love to share their traditional arts, their beading, their traditional cooking recipes. I just had somebody, sharing with me how they tried my recipe and loved it. Their family loved it. So it's something that's near and dear to us. And so it is something that we took advantage of in terms of going and sharing with the broader, public in Alabama, but then also nationwide, because people travel to this festival, that we are alive, we are here. We're very much still a population. Just because we were removed doesn't mean that our culture and who we are is gone.
And that, so that information that goes out does say descendants.
Yes, it says descendants of this vibrant culture return. That was just of note, just one. I didn't want to kind of bombard the slides, but there's tons of articles. You can go online and I think in a way that, kind of putting this out there, but I think that Moundville capitalizes on the tribe's participation because they showcase in these articles advertising both on their website and on their newsletters. Just how involved the tribes are. There's artisans that they ask to come down and help with exhibit planning, the long laundry list that I had. But again, it's something that we take pride in our culture. And so we wanted to share that.
I have to say, it does sound to me like the University of Alabama has a bit of a split personality on this issue, because just from the slides you showed us and the participation that seemed to exist between the tribes and the university at the Celebrate Native American conference or festival, however it's referred to, was a great opportunity for everybody to share and learn about the strong Native American culture that existed and still exists in the Southeast generally, let alone the state of Alabama. And yet we have this other situation with the human remains and funerary objects. So it would be a good thing overall if the university maybe could move closer together and focus on the appreciation side of things and not the well, we're not going to even talk to you about the other topic. In any case, I appreciate very much you sharing both your the information that you came to share with the evidence supporting cultural affiliation between the Moundville, the human remains, Native American human remains, and funerary objects from Moundville site and your various tribes, and but also sharing your experiences with the university, which has been a little bit disheartening. But again, hopefully that can be improved. I want to offer anybody another sort of last chance for comments, either from the presenters, if you have some additional points you'd like to make, or from the review committee. We do need to try to come up with the text of a finding. So it's going to take us some time to do that, but we've got a lot of information to work with, I think. But before we move on, Madam DFO, that would be the next order of business, I think, for the agenda. But before we move on, if there are other questions, John, was that a literal raised hand?
Yes, it looks like we have someone else from the presenters.
Oh, thank you, Tina. Yes, Tina,
Hi.
go, please. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to expand a little bit about that, the disassociation of the funerary objects from our ancestors, and offer a little bit of a different perspective, but one that's also very important. And that's the fact that, you know, our ancestors, for those few who were repatriated, and for those that may be repatriated, without sending them with the items that were supposed to prepare them and help them on their journey, we're not doing them any justice, and we're not moving this any further along for the health of our cultures who are here, who are still here today. So the health of our ancestors, once they've passed, and the items that we give them when they're supposed to be going upon their journey, you know, that has a direct connection to those of us who are still alive today. And it also has a direct effect on those who are going to be born generations from now, who will call us grandfather, grandmother, and will never even meet them. And so it's very important the University of Alabama and other institutions like them understand that what they're doing right now, by ignoring what we ask them to do, is having a direct effect on the people who are living today, the people who they invite to have a little festival. It's insulting. You know, our people, and most of us who are on this call and presenting to you today, would have to stay away. I myself would never go to Moundville because I'm not walking on a burial ground where it's been disturbed. And I'm not going to ask my children and put them in direct harm, knowing that it's been disturbed and the funerary objects are out there for public display. Once we put our ancestors to rest, we've just buried 20 in our tribe this year from COVID. Those 20 were put away the same way they have been for hundreds and hundreds of years. And to think that in the future, someone could possibly dig them up and take the things out and study them to see why we prepared them, what we sent with them, that's absolutely unacceptable, absolutely unacceptable. And so I just want to stress the fact of how urgent this really is and how serious their lack of concern, their lack of humanity, and their ignorance of our people, our culture, and their disregard for living Indigenous people is continuing the culture of genocide, plain and simple. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from review committee members or the presenters?
Yeah, this is Barnaby. You know, I fully agree with Tina's comments, especially in saying that there are other institutions, that museums that are have the same attitude. They don't want to comply. And it's really difficult to come together, the museum and the tribes, with respect, cooperation, collaboration. But they will never understand, meaning the non-Indian, our connections with our ancestors. And they don't realize how spiritually damaging it is with what they're doing, and they don't even realize, all the harm that they're causing, all because they don't want to comply. There should be some process for this kind of display of non-compliance for museums and institutions that, continue to not comply and honor the requests of tribes to return their ancestors for reburial. It's really difficult. There are other tribes that are having the same situation where it seems like there's nobody out there to help them understand. As I said, they probably never will understand. The only thing we can do is ask the Creator to be with us and give us that strength and see in the future that positive relationship in order to bring the ancestors home. So it saddens me and it saddens Native Americans throughout the country that this kind of situation continues. In as much as there are success stories, there's still a lot out there that are not successful. With this finding of fact request, if the museum's not, or Alabama, it's not, university is not wishing to determine cultural affiliation, or the tribes here wishing to proceed with a finding of fact to present to them in order to expedite some consultation for repatriation. Is that what the purpose of the finding of fact?
Thanks. Thank you, Barnaby. I think what we need to do as a committee is see how we can influence the situation and maybe do something that will move the museum closer to having a real meaningful dialogue and actually following through on some of the things that they have talked about doing. Thank you. Madam DFO, we thank our presenters and excuse them from the video part of this, or and then have our discussion, or would you think another break at this point, and then we just go through to the rest of the meeting after that?
I think a break would be prudent at this time, and when we come back, the committee will need to discuss what its finding will be. That will be the next agenda item, is a decision from the committee on this request for a finding. I don't know if any of the presenters would like to say goodbye or a closing.
I'd just like to say thank you. And what you're doing is very important. And may the Creator be with you.
Thank you. And thank you again for the presentations and the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Widow, thank you all.
Mado.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam DFO, 5 or 10 minutes?
What does the committee prefer?
let's take, oh, okay, Shelby, your hand speaks. Was that two of those or just one? Okay. Why don't we do a quick one? Let's come back in 5. Thank you. Thank you all. We'll be back soon.
Hello, everyone. If you could please come back. I've put on the screen some of the options that the review committee can consider as it proceeds to make a decision on the question that was presented to you in this finding. Mr. Chair, are you back with us? Just give a minute for Frank to join us. Hello, Frank.
Hi. Is everybody else back? It might have been a little long.
Yes. And I've shared on the screen some of the options for the committee as it deliberates on the question that was asked in the finding of fact.
Okay, thank you. Is there, this is just a question for content here. We need to make a recommendation regarding the cultural affiliation, or can we make, is it possible we make a recommendation to the University of Alabama about consultation as part of the finding?
That is certainly an option. But I think first and foremost, your duty is to respond to the requesting parties, being the tribes, and the question on cultural affiliation. I would say that's your primary decision point. If you want to make that decision and then attach additional recommendations, that's possible.
Okay, thank you. I can't see everybody's image on the on my screen here. I can see me, I can see Melanie, and I can see John, but not the other members. Is there a way to? So I don't know if anybody wants to make an initial statement, except myself or John, but does anybody else want to start a comment? Well, okay, then let me try. Okay, that's better. I can see Honor now. Honor, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd like to have a bit of a discussion about cultural affiliation to see how the committee is feeling about this at this point, as well as, you know, it's very disturbing to hear to me about the lack of engagement and consultation by the University of Alabama. Melanie, it looks like there are several options here. Is there an option to seek a consensus and a vote on that one issue, and also to invite the University of Alabama to come in front of us in the next meeting as well?
Again, I think you can take, as the last item here, take some other action or make some other recommendation on the question. And that could include additional information. But I would encourage you, again, to remember that what you're being asked here is the question of cultural affiliation, and it is based on the information that was provided by the tribes. So if you feel that the information provided by the tribes is not adequate or enough for you to make this finding of cultural affiliation, then certainly seeking additional information is an option. But I would encourage the committee to discuss clearly the question that you've been asked, and that is based on the information you've received, is there cultural affiliation?
Let me suggest something that we could say, and I would suggest it would be something like, our finding is that we heard a series of presentations from representatives from the Muskogee and speaking tribes, which indicate a strong case for the cultural affiliation between those tribes and the Native American human remains and funerary objects from the Moundville site. As a, again, to address the question, the question we've been asked. If phrasing it that way, I think answers the question, and then we could potentially have a second statement that recommended to the University of Alabama, or what the proper, University of Alabama Museums, whatever the proper term there is, that they renew or restart a conscientious set of consultations with the tribes to reach an agreement on repatriation. Any discussion of those proposals?
Frank, this is Honor, just to follow up on my prior question. At this time, I'm leaning toward cultural affiliation, but as the action that needs to take place at this point, given the overwhelming evidence that's been presented by the tribes. And at the same time, I would also like to see the University of Alabama in front of us to come forward and answer some of the questions about why CUI, why there aren't cultural affiliations, and why there appear to be barriers placed in front of tribes trying to follow a NAGPRA and get their ancestors and cultural items returned. So just going back to Melanie's suggestion, I would agree with cultural affiliation at this point. And I would also like to see the University of Alabama in front of us.
Okay, thank you, Warner. John, you have a comment?
Yes, thank you, Frank. My thought on this is that we stick to the pertinent question at hand, and then our discussion stays with. Certainly, we can think about and consider these other options, but I believe we need to stick with the pertinent question that's before us, and the particular statement about what we're going to say about the cultural affiliation question. That's been the presentation before us. That's the question. That's the question before us right now.
Frank, this is Barnaby. Yes, I agree as far as information that the tribes provided and presented regarding affiliation, cultural affiliation. I believe that was adequate and sufficient information to establish cultural affiliation with the human remains of their ancestors and the associated funerary objects.
Thank you, Barnaby. Shelby, you have a.
There we go. Didn't want to unclick there. Thank you, Frank, and thank you everyone for your comments. I feel that the tribes really presented a preponderance of evidence, both from an archaeological overview, as well as a cultural and ethno-historical overview that was very convincing and I think very, very important. I don't know if the University of Alabama has really heard this kind of presentation from them, but I think it would be probably helpful. But that said, I would argue, because of the presentations from the tribes that were, I thought, very well presented and very well organized, and I think actually backed up by a lot of evidence and documentation. So I would support a cultural affiliation finding on this particular question. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim, I can't see your image on my screen. I'm sorry, but do you have a comment as well you'd like to weigh in on?
Sure. I think you had said something about that they've made a strong case. I guess I would sort of change the structure of the sentence a little bit to say something along the lines of, there is a reasonable basis to determine cultural affiliation between the human remains and associated funerary objects originating from and adjacent to the Moundville Site 1 TU 500 and the Muskogean speaking tribes. I would actually recommend at the end of that sentence, we put in parentheses a list of all of the Muskogean speaking tribes. So we're being very precise, because I think the argument that was made to us was linking that site to all of the Muskogean tribes. And I think we need to be very precise and list them all.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, that sounded all right. I'm not quite sure about. I I think we could certainly list the tribes we heard from today, or that presented were part of this particular request, that we hear presentations and reach a finding, because not all the tribes on that list who actually presented written materials. I don't think everybody had each tribe had a representative.
Yeah.
But when we originally talked about the Muskogean speaking tribes, I thought there were additional tribes that might fit into that category.
There are.
And I would hesitate to sort of somewhat arbitrarily include them in that kind of a parentheses. Just that would be the only concern I would have about doing that. I think we should be as precise as we can be, and we could say we heard presentations and received written materials from the Muskogean speaking tribes, and then have a parentheses and include all of the different groups that both we heard from and presented something in the documentation that we received. Going beyond that, I'm just not sure that that we want to do that. After all, we're not trying to reach a decision on a dispute here, so we don't know all of the. We may know all of the participants, all of the interested parties, but I'm not sure that we do. I think if we come out with a finding that indicates that what we heard today in the presentations strongly supports a determination of cultural affiliation, that I would think hopefully would have a positive effect at the University of Alabama to get them to, again, restart their consultation and engage in good faith in that consultation with the tribes. But we could also urge them to do that within the context of the finding. May not be necessary, but we heard a strong case with lots of different kinds of evidence, very well delivered, well put together. And based upon those, I think we can say there appears to be there's a strong case for that kind of thing. We don't know what's going to happen next, and there may be other evidence that came to us in a different context that we need to look at in a fair manner as well. So I guess that's where I am on it. So I think we're all pretty much in agreement and going forward with the idea that there's a strong case here for cultural affiliation. John.
Yes, just to, I guess, backtrack to your points that moved us in this direction. I go back to that. We're here to answer We're here to answer the question that's before us. You just stated we don't know where it's going to go after that. The tribal nations who have come before us and made this presentations, that's the question that's put before us to answer about the affiliation question. If there are questions, if there are further questions between the university or findings on down the road between the tribes here and other interested parties, perhaps that's a question for another day. And even perhaps those discussions would not come before the review committee, and those solutions would be solved, or some sort of solution would come between those tribes and other sort of competing interests or things like questions like that. That's not the question that's before us today. And those discussions need first and foremost need to be happening between those I would say at the intertribal level for that to happen. Because let's not forget, we're also talking, not only are we talking about our cultural groups, we're also talking about tribal nations as sovereigns and the processes they have in place to come up with those solutions as well. And so again, probably a long way to say that this is the question that's before us. And if there are any competing interests or anything like that, if that's what we're trying to that's not before us right now. And I think to try to head that off, we don't know.
Yeah.
Thanks, John. I see that Melanie has in the chat box put a text, has a text there. Everybody have a chance to take a look at that? That's where maybe that's a good place to start.
That's the best my memory could do. Unfortunately, Lisa had a little bit of technical issue, and I generally rely on her to repeat motions. So I went ahead and put the what I thought between Frank and Tim, the finding was.
Yeah, I would like to somehow link it to the presentations that we had, and one of the reasons for that is one of the things we have to do in reaching findings is to try to be fair. And while we didn't hear very much, we heard quite a bit about some. I don't know how to phrase this. Some of the actions at the University of Alabama, we haven't heard their side, and their side may not be any different from what we heard, which would be fine. But if we base it upon the presentations that we did hear, I would say there's definitely a reasonable basis, reasonable case, even a strong case. And then, as I think John very rightly points out, we don't know what will happen next. It may come back to us in some manner as a dispute, for example, or something like that. But it may also be that a finding from us will move things along in a more positive direction, and things will get worked out in a mutually satisfactory manner between the tribes and the university in this case. John, you have your hand raised. Is that just from your last comment? Okay, thank you.
Well, again, I think your request is clear. Based on the information you received, is there cultural affiliation? I have added into the chat the requesting affected parties, as well as the two supporting tribes.
Okay. I see Stephen suggested something based upon the evidence before it, that he's referring there to the presentations. I think that would, we could say we could actually use presentations, but
I think it's probably better if you say evidence or information, given the amount of documentation in the materials that go far beyond what you heard.
That's a good point. Yes, and in fact, I would have included that by association, I think, but based on the evidence before it. Okay. Do the committee members agree that using these three chat texts, if maybe I were to work with the DFA on integrating it all together, we would have something that we would all agree to.
I just put a full statement in the chat.
Okay. How does that look? Anybody have comments or suggestions? Okay, Shelby, then John.
No, I think it looks good. I wouldn't change anything at this point. I think it looks, it clearly, I think is what we've been talking about. And we've added in the different tribes as well. So I think it covers Tim's concern as well.
Thanks, Shelby. John?
And just for clarification, so the tribal communities, tribal nations who were, as a part of their information that they presented in the presentations today, with the languaging, the reasonable basis in there, that's the request before us was for the finding of fact for cultural affiliation, but it was also, if I'm just so before we start to move forward, that it was also that in their presentations that they also feel that that they're meeting a reasonable basis, right? Correct.
They expressed a reasonable basis, which is the same as a preponderance of the evidence, 51%. They did definitely use the phrase preponderance of the evidence.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. I would just want to make sure that we're what's being presented before us, that on their from what's presented in their information, that that was the threshold that they were referring to as well, the preponderance of evidence / reasonable basis evidence, and that's what's being asked or presented to the review committee. That the presentations and the evidence meets that threshold.
Yeah, so you could certainly replace reasonable basis with preponderance of the evidence.
I think if we can leave it as is, that would be better. The phrase that I think the phrase that we were trying to answer is, and this was in Melanie's email to us this morning. The question is, quote, whether the human remains and funerary objects originating from and adjacent to Moundville are culturally affiliated to the Muskegon-speaking tribes. So they don't actually ask for us to say a preponderance of the evidence, but based upon the evidence that we've seen, that we saw today and that's in the written materials, there's a reasonable basis for cultural affiliation. I think says it in a way that if it came back to us in with a different set of facts or with additional facts or different facts or disputed facts, we have a basis for wouldn't be nailed down into one particular position. Honor, yes, you have a comment.
Thanks, Frank. I was just wondering if Brady could go over the difference between preponderance of the evidence and reasonable basis for the committee.
That would be fine. Stephen and Brady, do you want to weigh in on this? Can we do that, Madam DFO? Okay, Brady, you're showing your videos on, so go ahead. Then we'll get to Stephen.
Perfect. And you can hear me, Frank? Okay, folks can hear me. Excellent. The language used in the statute for the section in which a tribe might be showing cultural affiliation to move forward the repatriation process, particularly in the case where a cultural affiliation was not shown in an inventory of human remains, funerary objects, is preponderance of the evidence. That's the standard by which a tribe needs to which a tribe needs to provide evidence to show cultural affiliation. In practice, people have sometimes used a reasonableness standard as a stand-in for the concept of preponderance of the evidence. The reasonable basis might suffice. The essential concept is that it is more likely than not that this is the case. The preponderance of the evidence standard is that based on the evidence you have before you, it leans just slightly more that way than that way, which is why some folks have mentioned this 51% concept. There are all different ways of trying to explain this balancing of evidence. And in this case, as many of you have noticed, and the committee seems to be focused on, there's substantial evidence of that has been presented to you today for cultural affiliation. Whether that meets the preponderance of the evidence standard in this section on a tribe showing cultural affiliation to move forward the repatriation process under the Act. I think that's sort of it's somewhat assumed in the question presented to you today by the tribes, that if you're being asked to have a finding of fact on cultural affiliation, you're being asked whether they've met the standard that's listed there in the Act, basically saying that they've met that showing. Does that help answer the question, Honor?
Yes, thank you, Brady.
Thanks, Brady. Stephen, are you out there? Do you want to comment, or are you satisfied with the discussion? I take that silence to mean he's satisfied.
Generally, one lawyer is enough for all of us.
It's always nice to see Brady. Thanks for tuning in. Okay, then I'm going to, Tim?
I would prefer that we keep it as a reasonable basis.
Okay. Any other comments?
Tim, could you elaborate on your thinking behind that?
Tim?
Sure. I think because of the structure of what we've just heard, we've heard the tribal case on this, but we've not heard the museum case. So we're only basing our determination on potentially one half of the information. And I personally feel they have established a reasonable basis for determining cultural affiliation. In my mind, determining the preponderance of the evidence means a weighing between two sides, and we're missing one side. So I actually have a strong feeling about this, to the extent that if we go ahead with reasonable basis, I will support this. And if we change it to preponderance of the evidence, I will not.
Thank you, Tim. Any other comments? Then so the simplest thing at this point would be, if we are all satisfied with this, that we have a consensus determination that this is a reasonable way to describe our sense of describe the finding that we have. And if that's the case, Madam DFO, we don't need a formal up or down vote. Everybody says they agree. Your note this morning
That is correct.
threw me a little bit, and we could just say we have a consensus that,
I
we have
think-
a consensus, we have an actual unanimous.
I think for the purposes of the record, I would like to go ahead and call a vote to show that it
Okay.
is unanimous.
All right. Do you want to take us through that?
Brady?
You pull the names out and everybody responds.
Just because of the use of chat, I want to recommend that the finding you're voting on be read out loud.
Thank you.
So everyone can hear and it's in the record.
Thanks. Thank you, Brady, for the reminder.
Thanks, Brady.
I will do that.
DFO.
Yes, and then if I can find the chat window again. There it is.
Well, wait, Honor's got a last comment here to get in.
Hi, just one last question. I actually wanted to ask the presenters is if they're seeking this finding on a reasonable basis or preponderance of the evidence at this time.
Do any of the presenters want to comment on that, if we can allow that, Madam Chair, Madam DFO?
Yes, so we're seeking a finding on preponderance of evidence. Thank you for asking.
Thank you very much.
That was Ian Thompson with the Choctaw responding. I was not quick enough to get his video going.
Okay. John, go ahead. Oh, you're on the mute, John.
Sorry. Thank you, Frank, our chair. Just want to follow that was the I guess the basis of the thrust of my earlier question. And Honor, thank you for bringing that question forward in a more direct way. I guess so I'd want to say, and thank you, Dr. Thompson, for your comment, and perhaps others are still on, because if I was trying to recall in the materials and the request that's before us, and if I'm recalling right, there was reference to preponderance of evidence as opposed to reasonable basis. I thought there was some reference to that in some of the information in the documents that were presented.
Yes, that's correct, John. It's on page 4 of the
Okay.
request.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, John. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to point out that the standard for this, the statutory and regulatory standard of preponderance, would be the preponderance of the evidence before the committee, not the preponderance of whatever other evidence there may be. It is rather the preponderance of the evidence before the committee.
Which the council, which would mean, if I could ask a question about that, which would mean if there was in a different setting with additional evidence, there would potentially be a different outcome?
Could be, depending upon the evidence in that before the committee at that time.
Okay, thank you. So Madam Chair, maybe we do need to do a vote on the text here, or is there more discussion of the text here by the committee members before we do that?
Frank, this is Barnaby. it seems that the language or the term preponderance of evidence is more well known, and it seems to be the ultimate decision as far as identifying, acknowledging cultural affiliation, that the vote should be based on that very thing, whether to change to preponderance of evidence rather than a reasonable basis. Because I would vote for preponderance of evidence.
Thank you, Barnaby. John, and then Honor.
Yes, sorry, I tend to, I agree with that comment. That's before we move on, the question was whether changing the language from reasonable basis to preponderance of evidence. And so I tend to agree with perhaps making edit to be preponderance of evidence as opposed to the reasonable basis, because that's what was asked or presented before us in the information.
Thank you, John. Honor, did you have a comment, Honor, as well?
No additional comment. Thank you.
Okay. So an alternative to what's on the screen here would be something like the review committee finds, based on the evidence before it, that there is a preponderance of the evidence for cultural affiliation. That Melanie even beat me to the, got it written down before I managed to speak it out. John, you have your hand up again. Okay. Tim, have a comment?
Yeah, could we, in that case, bifurcate the recommendation that X number of the review committee members find, based on the evidence before it, that there is a preponderance of the evidence for cultural affiliation between human remains, funerary objects originating from and adjacent to Moundville and the Muskogee and Peking tribes, and X number of the review committee find that there is a reasonable basis for, to have two things. I can support that.
Just to be clear, then the review committee would be saying that there is a distinction between preponderance of the evidence and reasonable basis. And as Brady mentioned, those are similar ways of saying the same thing. And I would be a little concerned about what that might say to museums in terms of what a preponderance means versus reasonable basis. However, if the committee would like to have two motions, that's the committee's decision.
I won't support preponderance of the evidence.
We could go ahead and call a voice vote on the statement in the chat with preponderance of the evidence, and proceed with a finding that shows the vote result.
If I could just get on the record here of saying that I agree with Tim's concern. However, I think the phrase "based on the evidence before it" should be taken very explicitly to mean the evidence that we saw today in the presentations and the evidence that was submitted in writing. And in a different situation where there was different evidence or more evidence or contradictory evidence, that that the phrase preponderance of the evidence would, well, that the finding would potentially change in terms of what we found, because the evidence would be different.
Would you like me to read the statement of finding and then call a vote?
Yes, please.
The review committee finds, based on the evidence before it, that there is a preponderance of the evidence for cultural affiliation between the human remains and funerary items originating from and adjacent to Moundville, 1 TU 500, and the Muskogean speaking tribes, The requesting affected parties making the request for this finding are the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, the Chickasaw Nation, the Coushatta Tribe of Louisiana, the Muskogee Creek Nation, the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, with support from the Jenna Band of Choctaw Indians and the Alabama Coushatta Tribe of Texas. I'll proceed with the vote in alphabetic order. John Beaver,
Yes.
Honor Keeler,
Yes.
Barnaby Lewis,
Yes.
Tim McEwen,
Abstain.
Frank McManaman,
Yes.
Shelby Tisdale.
Yes.
So the results are 5 yes and 1 abstain. We can,
I'm sorry, Honor, did you say yes? I thought I heard a no, actually, but I might not have heard it properly.
I said yes. Thank you,
Oh,
Mark.
sorry. I'm sorry. Good thing we have other people checking here.
okay, with that decision, we can proceed then to publish a notice on behalf of the review committee related to this finding of fact.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I believe that there is an option for minority reports to be included with this.
I think we could do that. I don't know that I've seen one with the finding, but I don't know that there's any reason we couldn't. Madam DFO, to you, you're looking in a book there.
I believe that there was a minority report in a finding about a decade or so ago. I am looking at the current procedures. I don't recall.
Mr. Chair, I would recommend including the following statement in the finding.
Go ahead, Tim. Yes, you would what?
I recommend including the following statement in the finding.
Okay.
Could you read it?
Which reflects my position. One member of the review committee finds, based on the evidence before it, that there is a reasonable basis for cultural affiliation between the human remains funerary objects originating from, adjacent to Moundville 1 TU 500 and the Muskogean speaking tribes.
So basically it repeats the text, just substitutes that reasonable basis.
And I would request that this be included with the finding.
Mm-hmm. Madam Chair, are you looking at the March 2014?
Yes, we can certainly do as Tim requested and include the second finding statement. That's fine.
Do we need a vote on that? To include that?
Does anybody object to adding the additional statement?
This is Barnaby, no objection.
Pardon me, Barney, I didn't, Barney.
He said no objection.
No, thank you, Barnaby.
Okay.
Okay.
So we only have about 30 minutes left in our meeting. We must include an opportunity for public comment in this meeting. Give me a moment to turn on the chat. All right. If there's anybody here in the attendance today that would like to make a public comment, they can do so by putting something in the chat or by raising their hand. I believe there's a way for people on the phone to raise their hand, but I can't remember what it is. But if anybody would like to make public comment, you can raise your hand or put your name in the chat. In addition, I would remind the committee that you received one written comment at your last meeting on November 12th. That written comment was posted along with the meeting materials for this meeting. And this is an opportunity for the committee to discuss that written comment.
Madam DFO, when was that posted? Because I don't remember seeing it when I first looked at the meeting materials. Which, you know, I looked at them weeks ago when I, you know, to get the finding materials. So I haven't really gone back to them.
Well, we did send it directly to the committee members in the last email that Lisa sent prior to my message today. In addition to that, we did post it to the, I believe, to the meeting materials.
Well, I apologize then. I did not see Lisa's email either, but I'll listen.
There's no requirement for you to discuss the comments at this time. I just wanted to enter that in the record that you did receive the written comments and that it was distributed.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any hands raised at this time.
Honor, you've raised your hand, it says.
Thank you, Chair. I was just as a committee member wondering if there were any comments folks would like to make in public comment on non-compliance issues, and maybe if our presenters as well had anything further they'd like to say about their experiences with the University of Alabama. Thank you.
Kirk Perry has raised his hand. Kirk, if you just give me 1 minute, I'll allow you to turn on your video. Okay, Kirk, I think we can hear you now. And if you.
All right, I just wanted to say one thing to make it clear that the tribes submitted the claim to the University of Alabama more than 90 days ago. So the university has had that time to review our claim. And I heard a question a while ago, well, they ought to get a chance to look at it. Well, they have. And since they didn't respond, we came to the review committee. I just wanted to make that clear.
Thank you, Kirk.
Thank you.
I think we may have a request for a public comment from Shae Vassar.
It looked like she had a question in the chat.
Oh, she just hit her keyboard.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Shae. No problem. I didn't want to call somebody out with just a period in the chat, but if there is anybody who would like to make a comment, please put your name in the chat so I'll know for sure you mean it. Tim, Frank, it looks like Tim has his hand raised.
Oh, Tim, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead, Tim.
Based on what Mr. Perry just said, it would appear on its face that perhaps what he has just alleged constitutes a failure to comply under the regulations. Is that sufficient for the program to look into that? This is from Melanie, I guess.
No, the regulations require that we receive a written allegation.
So if I were to write that down and send it in, that would be good enough?
We certainly would encourage anyone who submits a written allegation to provide information specifically on which of the 9 ways a museum has failed to comply.
Thank you.
It does look like we have a comment in the chat. Theodore Isham, would you like to speak your comment? This one's short enough that I will read it into the record. This is a reminder about the linguistic evidence that the Muskogean language family as a language group that shares both a real and mother tongue affiliations, thus also it shares cultural affinities with each other. All Muskogean languages show a historical linguistic connection going back several thousands of years.
And that was laid out in more detail in the written materials than we talked about it today, I think.
Shae Vassar, although mistyped, also says thank you for recognizing me and thank you for allowing the public to view this committee meeting today. Mr. Isham continues, the University of Alabama and the state of Alabama are failing to acknowledge the sovereignty of the tribes and nations of the area. I do not see any other comments or hands raised.
So, Madam DFO, should we proceed with new business?
We do have a hand raised. Sheila Bird, if you would just give me a moment to allow you to turn on your audio and video. I'm sorry, Sheila, I can allow you to talk. Can't seem to promote you to be able to turn on your video. Sheila, you should be able to speak to the committee. Sheila, I think we can hear you now. Wait, I can see your microphone. Sheila. Sheila, can you try again to see if you can speak to us?
She may have to unmute. Looks like she may be muted.
She types, I can chat. Go ahead, Sheila. I will read your statements. Sheila Bird. Sheila Bird, sorry, technical difficulties. Sheila, if you would like to put your statement in the chat. Sheila Bird says, I just want to thank the tribes for remaining steadfast on such long-standing issues. This was one of Sheila's first, Sheila Bird says, this is one of my first when I became the TIPO in 2015. Her last comment is, dot, dot, dot. For the record, Sheila is with the United Kituwa Band of Cherokee Indians. Sheila Bird says, my last comment is the preponderance will not change regardless of what information Alabama brings forward. They have had plenty of opportunity to see any and all of this information and have turned a blind eye to our concerns on our ancestors. Thank you, Sheila, and I apologize for the technical challenge. Sheila says, thank you.
Thank you, Sheila.
At this time, there are no other hands raised.
Okay. Madam Chair, since it's going to be a while before we have a chance to get together again, why don't we look at old business and then any new business? Maybe we'll get through some old business. If I could actually raise one issue of old business, or am I out of turn doing that? Do you need to come up with a list for us?
I was just going to provide you with a little bit of an update. At your last meeting, I wrote down two issues of old business. The first being you asked for time today to discuss a request to the Government Accountability Office, or the GAO. I wanted to let the committee know that on your behalf, I reached out to the staff at the GAO and asked them to make a presentation to the review committee today. They were unable to make the presentation today, but they have agreed to present to the committee on February 28th at your meeting that is tentatively scheduled.
Great. Sure. Great. Thanks very much for doing that.
The other item of old business I had related to how to proceed with drafting a report to Congress for the current fiscal year that we are in, FY 21 to 22.
We're in 22 now, I think, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
We did 21. The last one the one we just finished was 2020 and 2021, I believe.
Right. So your next report would be October 1st, 2021 through September 30th, 2022.
You're referring to it that way. All right.
Honor.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Melanie. I had made a few requests in previous meetings. One being an update on any kind of movement that's gone through the State Department with regard to questions about ancestors and cultural items located overseas. And the second one had to do with any timeline having to do with the regulations that you might have an update on. Oh, and there's a third question that I had asked in a previous meeting about a compilation or the comments that have been submitted by the tribes that could be informative to the committee at this point. Thank you.
With regard to the last item, do you mean the comments on the regulations or what comments submitted by tribes?
I think
Yes,
she means the
comments
comments on the regulations that were received, because I was going to raise that as well. Honor did mention that, I recall, and I don't think we got anything in action going on some there. So
Certainly. So on those three issues, the first one being your request for an update from the State Department related to collections in foreign museums. I did speak with the State Department and they are not clear on what the reference is to. And I wanted to ask you, Honor, if you had additional specific information about perhaps when this survey was supposed to be conducted to their knowledge, and there's been some staffing changes there, but to the knowledge of the State Department, they weren't clear that they had conducted this kind of a survey.
Are you saying that nothing has gone through any of the embassies requesting information on Native American ancestors and cultural items in foreign museums?
I see. So it was a request to the U.S. embassies for information on U.S. collections in foreign museums.
That would be the specific question.
Okay, it wasn't clear to me at your last meeting what you were requesting. So I will go back to the State Department and with that more specific question of whether the State Department has made a request to U.S. embassies about collections from the United States in foreign museums.
And whether there's been any consultation with tribes regarding that as well. Thank you.
Honor, can I ask you a question about the State Department question you just asked? Was that part of the discussions about the STOP Act by any chance?
Oh, thanks for reminding me, Frank. I had also asked about any updates having to do with the STOP Act and NAGPRA and legislation that was going through or proposed in Congress.
Melanie, anything you can report on that?
Oh, I'm sorry. What was there a connection, Honor, between the request to the embassies from the State Department and the STOP Act? That was Frank's question.
These are two separate questions, but
okay.
I had asked for legislative updates as well. Thank you.
Okay. On your second and third issue related to the regulations. First, in terms of a timeline, there has been no change in what I reported to you on November 12th, that at this time, the department is still considering all of the comments that it received during consultation with Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations, and it has not made an announcement yet on what the next steps will be. So there is no timeline that I can provide to you. In terms of the comments, again, as I mentioned on November 12th to the committee, many of the comments requested that we share comments with other tribes, and some requested that comments not be shared. So again, at this time, the department has not made a decision on how it may or may not share comments that it received from Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations as a part of consultation. As I did mention on November 12th, you can find transcripts of each of the 4 consultation meetings that were held on the NAGPRA website under the regulations. In addition to that, a couple of different organizations have posted their comments on their websites. Those organizations are the Association on American Indian Affairs and the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. So those two comments are publicly available.
I have to say too, on the last two, I believe I found copies of those and have forwarded them to the committee members, although that was several weeks ago now. So it may either, Shelby's saying she got one. Okay, it should have gone to everybody. Anyway, I've got them. If you can't find them, let me know and I'll send them along. Those two, there's only those two is what I've got.
I will add that while the department may make a decision at some point about sharing those comments publicly, if there are any Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations that wish to share their comments directly with the review committee, a reminder that they will become public documents. They can be sent to me and I can forward those on to the committee as well as to place them on our website. But I do want to remind anybody that might submit comments that they are public documents and will be posted to the NAGPRA program website as well as distributed to the review committee. Are there other questions about the regulations?
Melanie, could you describe the difference in the process when something becomes a public document when submitted, just so folks know who may be submitting, between submitting it to the review committee and through the consultation process? And the reason I ask that is in our previous meeting, you had also mentioned that the Freedom of Information Act does not protect information that's submitted to the government.
So the Freedom of Information Act definitely protects some information that is submitted to the federal government. There's just a limit in how that can be applied in redacting information from someone that makes the request. So just to clarify that point, under the Freedom of Information Act, individual members of the public may make requests for information, but that is, and while that information is public information and can be released under that FOIA request, it's not quite the same as the information that would be submitted to me for the committee that we would post publicly on the NAGPRA website. And that is because of the public nature of the review committee's work, as well as the requirements under FACA and its regulations. Material that is provided to the committee also needs to be made public on a public facing website or other means of access. There may be other options in which I could limit public information or public posting of information that was submitted to me for the review committee, but in general, I share everything that comes to me for the committee through our website. In terms of the comments on the regulations, I can't speak to the what will happen with those documents. Those are certainly public documents in a sense that they've been submitted to the federal government. They could possibly very likely be subject to FOIA. I don't know what other options there might be for the department if there was a FOIA request for those comments. I also want to be clear that the department just hasn't made a decision about the next steps. And so until it does, it is still considering those comments. That doesn't mean that at some point those that information won't become available. It's just that at this moment in time, those comments are not something that I can share.
Madam Chair, I have two questions and that are both under old business. One of them having to do with regulations, which is whether or not you have any sense that the concern of the committee, which we've been talking about for at least a couple of years, I think, in terms of engaging with the department and with the National NAGPRA program and with the Solicitor's Office on regulation writing, has gotten any traction within the department. You know, we were all concerned when the July version of the rewrite came out, and we hadn't seen it and hadn't been involved in its production, and I think expressed our unhappiness and thought that this wasn't that the review committee should be involved in some fashion. Just if you could let us know whether there's been any discussions about that, or whether you have any thoughts about how we can do that.
Certainly, I shared the committee's position and request with the assistant secretaries, both in July and then as we concluded the tribal consultation. And at the time, the department has determined that it wants to carefully consider input from Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations before it determines what the next steps are.
Okay. Well, I hope you will continue to express our interest up the chain at the Interior Department on playing an active role in that, whatever the process is going to be. And the other issue that we've talked about many times, so it's old business, is the distribution of the already sent forward annual report to Congress from 2018, 2019, and the same, I guess it has to go through it. Well, it's the same process, I suppose, for the one that we just finished and asked you to move forward on at our last meeting or the meeting before. I forget which one it was now.
Yes, thank you. I don't want to not answer Honor's question related to the STOP Act.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
And then I'll respond to that one as well.
Thank you. I'm getting ahead of yourself. I'm getting ahead of myself.
That's okay. It's a good thing I got notes. So as it relates to the STOP Act, I could provide you with information that is available through congress.gov as far as the STOP Act, but I do not know anything more about what is happening in Congress related to that. If you're interested in learning about the current status of the law that's which is titled Safeguarding Tribal Objects of Patrimony Act of 2021. It is Senate 1471. And the House number of a similar related bill is HR 2930. Both of those, if you were to go to congress.gov and type in Safeguarding Tribal Objects of Patrimony Act of 2021, you can find the most up-to-date information on actions that have been taken by either House of Congress related to those two pieces of potential legislation. I really don't have any more information than that related to it. Is that answer your question, Honor?
Thanks, Melanie, for the direction to the government site on the STOP Act. Perhaps in our future meetings, you could just give legislative updates summarized to committee members. I think that would be helpful in formulating recommendations and reviews in the future of the committee.
Could you help me understand what it is you're asking for? Would you like me to summarize the text of the bill? Would you like me to tell you when the last action was taken by Congress?
Summarizing the actions in the text of the bill. Thanks, Melanie. I think Frank had a question there, and I'd like to get to it before the end of our meeting.
Okay.
Thanks, Honor.
Related to the report to Congress, thank you, Mr. Chair, for submitting an email to me requesting an update on the status of your 2018-2019 report to Congress. I was able to send that to the office that manages controlled correspondence for the National Park Service, the responsible party for that kind of report. I was told that the report is in the final stages of being distributed to Congress. I was not given a time frame, but I was told that it is close to being distributed.
Well, that's encouraging.
In terms of the report to Congress for 2019 to 2021, the last report that you approved at your November 12th meeting, we are still working on all of the additional documents as well as the cover letters that get attached to that. I can tell you that we have a goal to submit that into the tracking system by next Tuesday, November 30th is our goal to have that submitted. I will say that it's unlikely to go anywhere beyond my office until the other report clears. So as I think I described to you before, the Park Service does not like to have two moving at the same time. So as soon as what this means is that as soon as the earlier report is transmitted to Congress, we will start the process for the most recent report.
All right. Okay, well, thanks very much for those updates and the action. Tim.
Just one clarification that might be helpful in tracking down the report that I think Honor is asking for. The relevant request from the State Department to the diplomatic missions is an MRN, which is not a cable, but a particular type of diplomatic message. And it's 20 state 105062. And that should help State Department figure out what it is they're being asked for.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay, we are out of time for today.
Well, let me thank again our presenters and those who offered public comment as well, and of course the review committee and Madam DFO and the National NAGPRA staff for helping get this, keep the committee going and moving along, and to Brady and Stephen for the legal advice we got, or legal commentary and advice we got on some of our activities today. Madam Chair, what can we expect next? We've got potentially six meetings scheduled, but they won't start until the end of January. I presume we'll have an administrative meeting sometime before that to go over possible topics and things of that sort.
Yes, and I will certainly be working with you, Mr. Chair, on the agendas for those meetings. I do want to remind the committee as well as those in attendance that until there is a notice published in the Federal Register 15 days prior to that first meeting, the meetings are only tentative. So again, I want to be clear that while we have tentative dates scheduled and working towards getting approval for those, they have not yet been approved by the department.
So save the date just in case.
That's actually what we put on our website. And if you are looking for those dates, they are on our website at nps.gov/NAGPRA. Scroll down to the events page.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. And everybody on the committee and the other people we're all working with and the people in attendance, hope you have a happy holiday. Healthy and happy and safe.
Thank you all. The
We
meeting,
adjourned?
the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Madam
Take
DFO.
care. Happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays.
See you next
Bye-bye.
year.
That's right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.